IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. Happy Tuesday. It is now April 1st, and it's crazy that time is flying by. I can't believe it's already April. Still feels like the national championship game was a couple weeks ago. We're already gearing up for Notre Dame's 2025 season. They're halfway through spring, which, Brian, brings us to an interesting conversation today. And you and I are going to sit down and talk about where Notre Dame's position groups are as of today, April 1st, what we know, what we've seen. And we're taking all things into account here, but that's what today's show is going to be about, folks. We are going to talk about Notre Dame's offense and the specific position groups within them. We're also going to talk about the defensive side of the ball. A lot of different topics to cover here today. Brian's power is back on. We're ready to roll. We are good to go. Brian, how you doing today, man?
Much better. You don't realize how much electricity dominates everything that I can conceivably do as we had when we went that almost 24 hours without power. Of course, my wife was out of town, so I had to deal with the girls and then storms, and Rita gets freaked out during the storm. So it's a fun couple days. But at the end of the day, Trev, we're very fortunate. We're very blessed. There was no damage to our property. No loss of life. Tragically, there were a couple people in our community that did lose their lives because of the storm, and so that's obviously a very sad thing. And we've prayed for their families. And Angela was actually driving down to Syracuse, Indiana, when that hit. She thought she was going to be ahead of it. It hit a little bit sooner than expected. So it's a very scary time. But so we had to go without power for a little while, but we're back up and running, and ready to go, man. I'm ready to talk some Notre Dame football. We're going to talk, as you mentioned, position groups today. And then, of course, at the end, we're going to have a mailbag. So if you want to get your mailbag questions in there, feel free. Go ahead and get those in. We'll get to those at the end of the show. We'll talk for about an hour on the mailbag. But Trev, we were kind of thinking about just like, what are some fun topics to discuss, beyond the 2 4-up period practices we've seen, And we're like, well, before we get to this big spring practice and before we get to the spring game, we wanted to talk about where we think the position groups are right now. And so we're going to break down, we're going to go defense first, offense second. For those of you that get upset because we always go offense first all the time, we're going to go defense first today. And we're going to basically break them down sort of within each group. And then at the very end, we'll kind of rank them all 10 together. But it's going to go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the position groups on offense will be quarterback, running back, tight end, O-line, and receiver. And on defense, it'll be D-end, D-tackle, linebacker, corner, safety. And we're going to talk about where things are right now. So when we're talking about the receiver room, we're not talking about Malachi Fields. Obviously, there's some we believe to be injuries to the position right now. Defensive end, we won't be talking about where Boubacar Traore is part of the group and Jordan Patojo, and because they're not practicing right now. So it's basically, where are things right now in advance of the spring game. And then when we get out of the spring, we start looking ahead to the fall, then we'll kind of redo this again with the knowledge of what we learned from the end of spring, combined with, what arrivals are coming. And then also potential departures if any position groups lose players. But we hope not. But this is the world we live in now, where guys can jump in the portal, and the spring portal is just 2 to 3 weeks away. So we'll have that conversation then. But Trev, it's going to be fun. We're going to do our own top 5 ranking. And so Trev was going to give his 5. I was going to give my 5. So I'm like, all right, Trev, read me your 5. And I've got my 5 written down. I started laughing. I was like, read me your offensive ones. And he read to me. We have the same ones. So this is the Irish Breakdown top 5 of each position group. And Trev, we're going to kick off with the defense. And this is an interesting unit because there's some positions on the defense where you look at it and you're like, boy, there's a lot of bodies there, a lot of talent there. Other positions where there's not as much talent there. There's to the point where one position ranking I was thinking about making lower, but I was like, people's heads might explode if I put it any lower than it is. But it's just kind of it's like you had used the word State of the Union, and it's kind of that a little bit where when we were talking, you used the word State of the Union, you and I earlier today when we were game planning for the show. And then we were going to just kind of evaluate where things are right now. And when you look at the defense, this is an interesting period for the defense because there are some young guys that are getting time that haven't played a whole lot before. There are some guys that are ascending into hopefully bigger roles. There's some players who aren't here yet that we're gonna talk about here more. And so kicking it off with the defense, Trev, and looking at it 5-1, taking into account where things are now. Let me hear your number 5. Well, let's kick off number 5, and then we'll kind of snake order it a little bit as we go through 5-1.
Yeah, to get everything started today here, Brian, and the one thing that I will say before we kind of read off this list, and I know that you're in the same boat with me on this one as well, just because we have these rankings in order, whatever position group is our 5, that doesn't mean that we believe that they suck. It's just when you start ranking position groups, somebody always has to be last. And the one on that list for us, Brian, is the defensive ends for a number of reasons. For me, I had them ranked at number 5 because they are the position group on defense that I truly have the most questions about. Now, with that being said, I love the potential and the ceiling in that room. But to me, some of the questions that come to mind off the top of my head, how will Jordan Botelho and Boubacar Traore be after injury? Because there is a lot of assumption by some that say, well, the DN room is going to be fine when they get Botelho and Traore back. It's like, potentially. But we don't know what that looks like. Notre Dame had, a tight end last season with a lot of potential based on some of the sample size of what we saw in 23. He tore his ACL and he didn't come back quite the same. And it took him a little while to get his footing and to get his feet under him a little bit. So all of those questions around those two guys returning from injuries up there for me. Will Bryce Young take the step? And I actually had to change the wording in my notes because at first I said, can he? And it's like, well, I mean, he absolutely can, but will he? Because he is a big part of that defense. He's a big part of the edge rush. And he had a good true freshman season. But now can he take that foundation of, hey, I'm the exciting 6'7", 260-pound true freshman to, hey, I am now a week in and week out impact player on this defense. Will he take that step? I think that's up a little bit for debate. I believe that he can. Another question that I have is, what role will Junior Tuihalamaka play with this edge rushing group? Last season, when everybody was healthy, Junior Tuihalamaka didn't play any defensive snaps the first 2 games. But Bryce Young did. They were limited, albeit, I mean, you go back and look at Pro Football Focus, I think Bryce Young played 1-2 defensive snaps against Texas A&M, and then he didn't play at all, I don't think, against Northern Illinois. But that's 2 more snaps than what Junior got. So what is his role going to be when some of those players come back healthy? How well is Logan Thomas progressing? I know a hot topic of conversation has been his weight. He came onto campus under 200 pounds. He got up to 225. Now he's back down to 213. We've discussed it before, and there's a lot of different factors that go into when a player weighs in. Brian, you talked about one time you knew of a player who went to weigh-ins the day after he got done being sick with the flu. And so he was just naturally lighter in weight. And so you don't know what all situation plays in there, but that is a question that I have for Logan Thomas. And then from a coaching standpoint, biggest question that I have for this group, will Al Washington continue to add to this group as a whole's pass rushing arsenal? I love Josh Burnham and what he's able to do in the run game. Can he get Josh Burnham, and can Josh Burnham elevate to that next step in becoming almost an every down type of D end? Is he going to be able to generate more of a pass rush? Because we've seen what he's been able to do in the run game. Will he continue to do that for Bryce Young? Will Coach Washington continue to help mold and develop Logan Thomas? So for me, those are all of the reasons why I put the defensive end group at the bottom of my list. And that doesn't mean that I don't think that group has a really high ceiling. But out of all the groups that have a really high ceiling, they're the ones that I have the most questions about, Brian.
I was kind of laughing as you were talking, Trevor, not just because I disagreed with your ranking, since we literally have the same exact ranking, but it was more of and it kind of goes into what you and Sean were talking about yesterday. Weakness on this team has to be defined differently than weakness on past teams. Weakness on 2021 is like that O-line could get you beat by just about anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Weakness now is like, okay, it only allows them to go to the semis, not the championship. kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the bar has been raised incredibly much, much higher. And that's the conversation you have when you're talking about teams like Ohio State and Texas and Alabama and Georgia. Most years it's like, okay, are they going to win it all? Or are they only going to, make the first round? Or are they going to make the semis? It's not like, are they going to go 8-4 this year? I mean, the bar's just been completely raised and changed. And think about this. You and I agree that a defensive end room with Bryce Young, Josh Burnham, Junior Tuihalamaka, and Logan Thomas right now is the quote-unquote worst, or I should say lowest ranked group for a Notre Dame football team. Defense. Like, that says a lot. That says a lot. And, but not having Boubacar, not having Jordan Patelho, not having Chris Burgess and Dom Hulak. I mean, the numbers are thin. And the guys that are there are talented, but there's also question marks. And so that's where you have to put, in my opinion, you got to put this group last. I don't think it was a huge difference between this one and my next one for similar reasons, but it really comes down to our number 4, Travis safety. And here's what really separates the two for me. Notre Dame's safety position right now has the more proven established player in a Don Schuler compared to defensive end, where I think Bryce Young has a chance to be a beast someday. I think Josh Burnham is going to be a very good football player for Notre Dame this upcoming season, and was a good football player last year. Junior Tuihalamaka showed his worth. Like, that kid's going to play this year. There's no question. How much does he play both sides? Do some of the adjustments we expect to see, and as far as like how they're going to use their ends, does that allow him to kind of play both sides? Is he going to be stuck at Viper? Logan Thomas he's 213, but he's super athletic and twitchy. And I'm watching in the second half of the Louisville game. I'm doing a film breakdown right now for the defense, and I'm watching the second half of the Louisville game. And there was times, Logan Thomas played a decent amount in the second half. And there was times where him and Bryce Young were on the field together. That's in game 5. That's not like, game 3 or some blowout game later in the year. That's game 5 in a game that was decided by a touchdown. So, but it's the numbers, and it's safety. You do have a Don Schuler. You can't discount that, because the safety position has some of the same, concerns that the defensive end position has. Jalen Stroman's hurt. He's not practicing. If Jalen Stroman was healthy and practicing, I'd have a difference of opinion. I'd have a different opinion maybe on where the safety room is. But because we don't know who the next guy is going to be, Luke Talich is unproven as a safety. Kennedy Urlacher's unproven as a safety. Bronte Johnson's unproven as a safety. You look at Jadon Blair's unproven as a safety. Ethan Long's unproven as a safety. But all those names I just mentioned is also why I have them ahead of the defense, because even though there's actually more proven players at the defensive line position as far as experience, the one established standout is at safety. But there's more numbers and even more upside potential at the safety position. So if you wanted to go safety 5 and DN 4, I would not have complained about that if anybody wanted to do that. But I'm going to go with the safety group being 4 because of the uncertainty at the position that's similar to defensive line. But even though defensive end has more guys that have played established minutes, none of them are the standouts that Don Schuler was. And the other part too is I love the potential of these guys, but I also love the potential of Bronte Johnson and Jadon Blair and Luke Talich, and that group of players is also very exciting. And Kennedy Urlacher and guys like that. So that's why I have safety slightly ahead of the defensive end position. It's not a huge gap, Trev, but that's why I have the safety position where I do, is because of that established standout. I expect one of the team captains this year to be a safety, and not just because he's a leader, but also because he's a really good football player.
You and I view it very similar. It's the DN position doesn't have that Don Schuler. Now, what I think would have made this conversation super interesting, playing a little bit of the what-if game here, is what if one of Boubacar or Jordan Patello, based on the trajectory of the season we thought he was going to have, was healthy and played that entire time? So I do think, but folks, like that's the small margin of error that we're talking about for this team of how good we believe that they can be. Another factor for me that went into putting the safeties at 4 is Jadon Blair is an interesting person when you think about him in whole. I love Jadon Blair and his ceiling. It makes sense why he's as talked about as what he is. I mean, he's a 6'5" safety, highly touted crew. He's rangy. He can cover. I mean, he tackles really well. He's instinctive. He's a smart guy. But on the flip side, I do think that it's interesting that one of the most talked about players in that safety room outside of Adon Schuler has yet to take a snap of college football. Not a meaningful snap, but just a snap of college football in any capacity. And so that was another reason why I ranked them a little bit lower on my list. But again, same conversation with the DNs. Their ceiling is just so high. And that's what makes talking about the 2025 season so exciting. That's why I can't wait for it, is to watch it all unfold, truly.
I don't know if there's a position group on defense that if everybody hits has a higher ceiling than the defensive end position. Like if everybody hits, I mean, you've got two guys that can play at high first-round draft pick ability. They're a long way away from being there. Thinking of Boubacar and Bryce Young, but they're there. And that's projecting with the whole room being there. But for right now, obviously it's there. Number 3, Trev, defensive tackle.
Yes, sir.
I think this surprises a lot of people based on what I'm saying. There's people that have the D tackles 5th. And I think some of you need to remember we're talking about who's on the roster right now. Because the one position group that's not missing anyone that we expected something from is D tackle. So let's talk about why D tackle is number 3 and not 4 or 5 like a lot of people have it ranked right now.
I definitely understand where a lot of people are coming from in the chat, because when I first made this list, what I like to do when I put lists like this together is I'll write out initially what I think, and then I kind of go back through and evaluate and, okay, well, maybe this could be higher, this could be lower. And I did start out with defensive tackle lower than where I had them at 3rd. Now, when I sat down and I went through, I almost had a similar revelation to what Chris Ash had. Chris Ash talked about in his press conference, he was like, yo, one of the position groups that stood out to me, I didn't think we had this much depth along the interior defensive line. And so then you really sit down and you start thinking about, it's like, they do have a lot of talent in that room. And to what Brian said, they're not waiting for a Boubacar to come back, a Jordan Patello to come back,
Jared Dawson to show up this summer.
Yes. Yeah, yes. They're not waiting for Jalen Stroman to come back off of injury. They're not waiting for true freshmen to develop. They still need players to develop. But kicking off this room, you have 2 guys in Gabriel Rubio and Donovan Heinrich that played the entire postseason. Whereas Gabe Rubio had to step up against Georgia in Notre Dame's arguably their biggest game in a very long time and start. After not being with the team in spring, missing the first half of the season with a foot injury, he was called upon to start and played a good game. Room to improve, and I think we can all agree upon that. But that's your foundation. And then you start looking at what are the other contributing factors to this room. Jared Dawson is here. Elijah Hughes, they're both here as mid-year transfers. They're getting acclimated to their teammates. They're getting accustomed to what Chris Ash's system is. They're getting used to Coach Washington and the other guys in the room. And they're going to be big contributions this season. Then you have the up-and-comers. You have guys like Armel Mukam, who people have talked about as having a really good spring so far. And people have talked about Armel making that jump and really solidifying himself within that rotation. Long way to go, because you still have to go through summer and all of fall camp. He has to stay healthy and he has to stay consistent. But Armel Mukam is the guy that could make a splash in this defensive line rotation on the interior. And then you have other guys like Brennan Vernon, who are still putting on weight, getting used to moving from the outside to the interior. But Coach Washington in one of his press conferences also talked about how Brennan is putting in the work that he needs to do to put his name in the rotation as well. Another thing about the interior defensive line that stood out to me is they're getting bigger across the board, which is something that not a lot of teams can say when they lose a guy like Riley Mills, who is 6'5", 6'6", 300 pounds. But when you go and you look at this room across the board, you know, you have Jason Onye, who's 6'5". He's up to 308. Armel Mukam is 6'3". He's 305. Jared Dawson's over 300 pounds. Gabe Rubio is up to 319. He's 6'5". Donovan Heinrich last season was playing at 271, listed. He's now at 280. Elijah Hughes, he's 6'3", 290. So the way that I look at that is, yes, excuse me, you lost a big body in the interior with Riley Mills. But you still have Jason Onye, who's back with the team. He's maybe a couple pounds lighter than what Riley Mills was playing at. I think he's a couple pounds heavier than where Riley Mills was at the start of the season last year. You have a guy like Gabe Rubio, who's a slightly bigger body, not quite as long as Riley Mills, but still a big body. And then the guys that you have in there to replace a 6'1", 6'2", 275, 280-pound Howard Cross is 6'3", 290 Elijah Hughes. You have 6'1", 300-pound Jared Dawson. You have 6'4", 290 Brennan Vernon. And so the D-line unit as a whole on the interior has gotten bigger. They've gotten more size, which I believe is going to fit a little bit more schematically with what they want to do. And so that to me is why they moved up the rankings in my list, because once you sit down and break down the room, yes, every player in there has a way to go, but you could say that about every single position that we're going to talk about today.
In April.
Yes. And so that to me is why I have defensive tackles at third.
I have him third and also honestly thought about putting him second. And I'll explain why when we get to the cornerback room. Because again, this is right now, where they are right now. But you can't dismiss the depth of this unit. There is no position group on defense that comes anywhere close to having the number of guys that have played the number of snaps that this group is better. There's a discussion going on in the board about replacing Howard Cross is going to be hard. He was an All-American caliber player. Bro, he was an All-American caliber player 2 years ago. He was not last year. You're not replacing 2023 version of Howard Cross. You're replacing 2024 version of Howard Cross. The other thing is when I look at the defensive tackle room, you didn't have Jason Onye most of the year. Gabriel Rubio missed a quarter of the year and was never fully healthy until the end of the season. And so you lose Howard Cross. Okay, Howard Cross was nowhere close to how good he was the year before, in my opinion. You lose Riley Mills, that's a big blow. Because once Riley Mills got going, which kind of started with Louisville, he was really good until he got hurt against Indiana. But you went out and beat Georgia and Penn State with these guys. So you bring back Gabriel Rubio, you bring back Donovan Heinisch from that group, you bring back you add Jason Onye, you add Jared Dawson, you add Elijah Hughes, you bring back Sean Sevillano, you bring back, just that entire rotation that played your last 3 games, plus 2 transfers. So when I look at this group, it's like, dude, you added more than you lost. Now the question is, can anybody play to Riley Mills' standard? I would argue Jared Dawson was a better player than Howard Cross was last year for a chunk of the season, especially if you evaluate them on a per snap basis. Now the question with Jared Dawson is, can he play the number of snaps that you're going to get? But when I look at this room right now, you've got Gabriel Rubio. You've got Donovan Heinisch. You've got Jason Onye. You've got Jared Dawson. You've got Elijah Hughes. You've got Sean Sevillano. You've got the young guys you mentioned. And here's the other part of it. Some of the things I'm hearing about it from the spring, and I'll just give a little teaser. I'm going to have more about this after the spring. But I was talking with someone a week ago, and he was telling me a story about how there was an NFL scout on campus, or an NFL coach on campus. And he went up to some of the Notre Dame coaches. This was relayed to me. And he was like, there's a dude on that group that no one's talking about that's going to be an NFL player. He's an up-and-comer. And they're like, you talking about number 30? He's like, no. He's like, no. He's like, he's the son of a Hall of Famer. We all know who that guy is. And he said it's 88. He's really had a strong spring so far. Now, of course, it's got to carry into the fall and all that, but we're talking about where they are right now. And right now, this is the deepest position group on the team, and there's a lot of guys that have played a lot of meaningful minutes at this position. No position group has someone like a Rubio, like a Heinisch, like a Dawson, like a why am I drawing a blank on Onye? That's got that kind of 4-man group that's played this much, that then goes beyond that, because we'll talk about linebacker in a minute, could match that 4, but then it kind of stops. This group's got a lot of talent, a lot of experience, and it's a lot bigger than it was last year, as you mentioned. So I like where this group is at right now, but the difference when we do sort of a preseason ranking is the cornerback room's going to add some dudes. The safety room's going to add some dudes. The DNs are going to add some dudes. And the D tackle's not adding anybody, because this is what the room is going to look like in the fall. And that's what really separates it from every other group except for one of our top 2, which we'll get to. but I love the depth of this room. The question is, and this is where I think it's a fair question, and this is where I think Andrew and I could agree on, is I think top to bottom, this D tackle room is going to be better than last year's D tackle room for a host of reasons. Number one is D tackle they were never healthy, right? In the one period of time where the starters were both healthy, they played pretty average football first 4 games of the year. And then by the time the starters started playing well, Louisville, Stanford, then Onye went out, who was playing arguably the best football. Rubio didn't play until game 5 or 6. I think Rubio's first game back, was Stanford. He missed the first quarter of the season. Mookum was just now working into this thing. So it wasn't a great position group last year for chunks of the season. And then also you got to remember that when Cross got hurt against Florida State, and he was never the same player after that. It's never the same player after that. So that's why I really like this D tackle room, and I don't think the replacement, somebody made a great point, said on paper, this argument's correct, but again, you're just looking at who they had last year on paper. But if you're acting as if Notre Dame's got to replace an All-American named Howard Cross, no, they don't. They're not replacing that. That version of Howard Cross was 2 years ago. The version we saw this past year was not an All-American. And didn't play like an All-American. So it's just a different animal, Trev, than what maybe some people are thinking. But I love the depth of this room. Number 2, I was surprised you had this. So this is why I thought we were going to have a different ranking. I thought that number 2 was going to be something different for you, Trev. But we both went with number 2. Cornerback.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the de facto number 1 for a lot of people. So let's explain why. Because, again, it's a ranking for where they are right now on April 1st. We don't do April Fool's jokes. So this isn't some sort of April Fool's joke. This is an evaluation of where they are right now. So go ahead, Trev.
When you talk about the cornerback room, and this is one of those where I am okay if somebody wants to put them first because I understand what the argument is there. For me, I like the fact that Brian separated this when we were talking about the idea for the show of separating safeties and corners, because if we were talking about the secondary as a whole, I think they would have been my number 1. But just talking the cornerback room as a whole, obviously you start out with the good. Christian Gray and Leonard Moore have the potential to be the best cornerback duo in college football this season. And that's something we've said about Notre Dame's cornerback duo for the 3rd year in a row. We said that about Cam Hart and BMO. We said that about BMO and Christian Gray. And now we're saying about Christian Gray and Leonard Moore. So we'll call them who they are. They're proven players. Between the two of them, they played over 1,500 snaps last year. It's an awesome duo to be bringing back when you're talking about somebody that was a true sophomore and a true freshman a season ago. And so for me, that puts them at number 2. But why did they not get to the number 1 spot? That's the biggest question. And for me, it's for a handful of reasons. 1, 2 of your highly touted recruits that are coming in, and Mark Zachary and Dallas Golden, are not yet on campus. It's a similar conversation. I'm going to have a similar conversation. I don't know if Brian will as well, to some of the position groups on offense. Now, when you go and you look at the makeup of the rest of the room, it is very unproven. The potential's there and the ceiling is great. I love what Carson Hobbs brings to the table from a tools standpoint, but I got to see him do it in meaningful minutes.
Right.
Cree Thomas has been having a really good spring. And the evaluation that Brian and I talked about when we were going over his film, and it was like after Notre Dame did their national signing day, Cree Thomas was somebody that jumped out to the film to me. I know Brian had watched his film a lot more extensively than what I had. But the biggest jump that we talked about was he looked like a more natural corner. He was smoother. He played faster, and that's starting to reflect in the spring. I also didn't know that he went to the same high school as Ben Morrison, so they have a little bit of a relationship there too. That was cool that he talked about that in one of his media sessions. But with that being said, with how exciting those guys are, they're unproven at this level up to this point. They could, because I think Notre Dame's defense is going to do a little bit more rotating this year. I don't know how much they're going to ask Leonard Moore and Christian Gray to not be on the field, but I see Carson Hobbs playing a little bit more, especially down the stretch, than what previous years may have dictated. We also added the nickel position into this. Devontae Smith, really exciting player. I've liked what I've seen from him so far in the spring, albeit it's a combined 8 practice sessions with 2 of them being special teams work. But Devontae Smith is as advertised. He has the potential to be Notre Dame's best nickel pickup. And believe me, that's not a shot at Thomas Harper or Jordan Clark because they played outstanding football for Notre Dame. But Devontae Smith brings some of the elements that made both of them in Jordan Clark and Thomas Harper good individual players. But when you sit down and you look at what this cornerback makeup is, there's only two guys in that entire room that have done it in a Notre Dame uniform, and it's Christian Gray and Leonard Moore. Devontae Smith, I'm confident that transition is going to be fine. But then you get into the depth conversation. What if one of them gets hurt? God, you hope not. But if they do, you're replacing them with either a true freshman in Cree Thomas, Dallas Golden, or Mark Zachary, or in a guy like Carson Hobbs, who high ceiling, but he was in the same class as Leonard Moore, and he's still pretty inexperienced. And so when you're in comparison with what that number one group is, those were some of the separating factors for me. Because if you just look at it in a vacuum and say, corners should be number one because they have Christian Gray and Leonard Moore returning, I'm not going to have a whole lot of argument outside of that, but then it's what do you have behind them?
Right.
And that was the separating factor for me, Brian.
Right. Where at linebacker, let's just say we project, for argument's sake, Drake Bowen and Jaden Osbury as your starters. Your next two are Kingston and Jalen Sneed. Like, it's just different. And that's it for me, Trev. It's that right there. I think if we're going to talk about, if we were to say, okay, just starting lineup, we're just ranking starting lineup. We don't care about depth. We don't care about what if someone gets hurt. We're just going to pretend that football is a sport that doesn't include injuries. This is a no-brainer, number one, in my opinion. I mean, well, I should say no-brainer. I'm still going to debate with you linebacker, but it's number one for me. But it's what's the depth like? We just watched last year where there was a situation where Notre Dame, after 6 games, lost their All-American corner to a season-ending injury. And now you're in a situation where it's like, okay, you're going to be all right there. And they were, because they had a guy like Leonard Moore that could step up. Leonard Moore had played a decent amount up to that point in time. He had started the game against Louisville. I like to point out, too, to people in the chat that the game where Leonard Moore gave up the most catches all season was that game. Yes, it's also not a surprise. He was playing field corner that game, not boundary. It's a little tougher position the way that Notre Dame had it for especially a younger player. But anyway, the point is that's a dynamic 1-2 group, and we're splitting hairs here between two elite groups. And I thought it was interesting when ESPN did their rankings for strengths. There was somebody who kind of got a little upset. They're like, how do you not have the running back room as the biggest strength? And almost kind of like thought ESPN was being a little bit, anti Notre Dame. And I'm like, y'all, this is the same people who I am not going to defend unless they need to be defended. You know my stance on ESPN, but they do have Jeremiah Love as a preseason first-team All-American. So a team, a unit that has a preseason, according to that outlet, first-team All-American is not their number one strength. The secondary says a lot about the talent Notre Dame has coming back. But I am concerned about a 16 game season about the depth. Could Carson Hobbs step in and shine? Yeah, he could. We don't know. Could Dallas Golden step in? Could Mark Zachary step in? Sure, they're capable of it. Cree Thomas, you've talked about, who's looked pretty decent from the different people I've talked to. And then just what we've seen moving around has looked really good. Sure, but there are way question marks where I know if something happens to Drake Bowen, you're putting in Kingston. I know what Kingston can do. I've seen him do it. If something happens to Jalen Sneed or Jaden Osbury and you've got to go with the other one, you're fine. You're going to be good there. And that's even before you get to Madden Faramo and Preston Zinner and Bodie Cahoon and Teddy Rizak and Anthony Saka and all the other guys that make that a low. Kahan Okia, who's still out. I mean, that's a loaded room. And that's honestly, Trev, as we kind of transition to sort of the number one, that's why the linebacker room is number one for me. It's for a team that's competing for a championship to be number one, you've got to have, to me, big-time talent, which is a check. Drake Bowen, Kingston, Jaden Osbury, Jalen Sneed as the proven talent. Madden Faramo's a big-time talent. Anthony Saka is a top 100 a caliber prospect. You've got Preston Zinner, who I like a lot. You've got Bodie Cahoon, who I graded as a 4-star player. You've got Teddy Rizak, who's might be one of the 2 or 3 best athletes at the entire position. And you start saying, like, boy, this is a really deep room. If you just look at where it is, even just for the spring, where there is no Kia, there is no Saka, there is no, well, neither one of the Kias are right there right now because Josiah is still in high school. Kahanu's hurt. But you still have the four that we know about. You still have Preston Zinner. You still have Bodie Cahoon. You still have Teddy Rizak. And you still have Madden Faremo. That's incredible depth. Incredible depth. Right now, before you even add Anthony Saka, get back Kahanu Kia from injury, who was one of the standouts of the spring game last year. It was all over the field last year, Kahanu was. And I'm like, it's going to take him a while to get caught back up to football. He's been on a Mormon mission for 2 years. It's going to take him some time. And the guy goes out and has like 8 tackles in the spring game. And you're like, seriously, dude? Like, I'm trying to give you some time here to get back into the groove of things, and you're making me look bad. Come on, dude. With all these plays you're making. I say jokingly, obviously. And so that's kind of where it is. And then the interesting thing was you could talk about Devontae Smith being a nickel, being a corner, and we kind of put him at corner, but the reality is he hasn't been very good as a corner. He's been good as a nickel. Now, if you were to say, okay, do you want to count him playing nickel as corner? That's what could maybe flip this. But even then, who's the backup? Ben Minnick, a guy we've never seen play a meaningful down before. So it doesn't really move the needle when you include Devontae Smith, because I don't think he's someone that's going to step in and thrive playing just pure corner the way that you would need to if somebody went down. So Drake Bowen, big-time talent. What's the other thing you need? You like experience. This group has that. You know, you look at last year's production on defense. You've got look at the number of snaps this group played last year. You know, Drake Bowen played 615 snaps last year. Jaden Osbury played 438 snaps last year. Jalen Sneed played 433 snaps last year, and Kingston played 343 snaps last year as a true freshman. And then Jalen Sneed comes into the season with over 700 career snaps. You know, as a guy that was third on the returning group for snaps last year, is number 1 on the group in overall snaps. So you're going to have 4 guys with over 340 career snaps coming back. All of them had over 10 pressures last season. All of them had over 10 run stops last season. So proven, you've got snaps, you've got proven production. And then, of course, depth. The depth is outstanding. Just where it is now. Forget even getting like the other guys we talked about. It's hard for me not to go with that group number 1. Because what's the one position group that you could argue can match cornerback in elite talent? And I think you could make a case even when – like, it's not a given for me. I said it earlier, but I was being a little bit hyperbolic. It's not a given to me that when the cornerback room gets to full strength that I'm going to necessarily jump it up to number 1. That's how high I think it is linebacker room. And, you know, it's going to be fun to watch. And it's a room where you have a lot of leaders. Yeah, that's another part of it too. There's a lot of high character young men there that I think could shine in that, you know, as captains. I mean, it wouldn't shock me if someday Jaden Osbury was a captain. It wouldn't shock me if someday, you know, Kingston's a captain. It won't shock me if someday Madden Faremo's a captain. It won't shock me if someday Bodie Cahoon's a captain. It won't shock me someday if Preston Zinner was a captain, like a Bo Bauer type of special teams type of captain. I mean, there's a lot of guys in that. I mean, it wouldn't shock me if someday Anthony Saka was a captain. I mean, there's a lot of character in that room too. A lot of football smarts on top of a really athletic group, really talented group, and a really experienced group. So that's why linebacker for me is number 1, Trev. How'd you see it that led you to have them as your number 1 group on defense?
Very similar. Their experience jumps off the page at you. You know, you brought up the amount of snaps that they played in the linebacker group just in 2024, just the 4, Bowen, Sneed, KVA, and Osbury, obviously leaving Jack Kaiser out of this conversation, played 1,829 snaps. You know, and you add Jack Kaiser into that mix and what the linebacking core did in 2025 between 5 guys, you know, they played over 2,400 snaps in a season. That's a lot of experience, and you return almost 1,830 of that, which is absolutely huge. They have the talent there. The depth is insane. I mean, there's a world where if Notre Dame's defense was running a true like 4-3, which they're not, I'm not putting that out there. It's just in this scenario, you lose your starting 3 linebackers. Let's just say you lose Drake Bowen, Jaden Osbury, and KVA. You're left with Madden Faremo, Preston Zinner, and Jalen Sneed. I mean, that's just otherworldly depth. And I'm interested to see how Chris Ash uses them in the rotation. Max Bulla did a really good job last year with managing what that was. I think you're going to see a lot of the same. But when I look at this room, whoever is on the field for whoever, I don't see a drop in production. And that's huge for me. That was another differentiating factor for me when I talk about the cornerback room. Leonard Moore, Christian Gray, great. KVA Drake Bowen, great. But if Jalen Sneed and Jaden Osbury come on the field for them, I don't think there's going to be as much of a drop-off in production as if Carson Hobbs and Cree Thomas had to come in for the cornerback room. Not to say that it would be bad, but that's how I view it because we got to see what that sample size was this past year.
So like right now, you could say, okay, let's just go with the returning starter that we know, Drake Bowen, and then the most experienced guy is your number one at will. Let's just go with that for the sake of argument. So you've got Drake Bowen and Jalen Sneed as your starting lineup, and then let's say you rotate in your number twos on Series 2. That's Kingston Viliama-Asa and Jaden Osbury, two guys I graded as top 50 recruits. Like that's a better starting duo than a lot of teams Notre Dame is going to play this upcoming year. Except maybe Pitt. Pitt had 2 of the top 10 returning linebackers in the country, according to Pro Football Focus. Yeah. I was like, okay, that's interesting. I knew the one kid would be in there, but I didn't know they'd both be in there. But point is like when you're bringing in that, and then your third team would be what? Like Madden Faramo and Preston Zinner? Really? Your fourth team is what? Bodie Cahoon and Kahanu Kia? Well, actually, Kahanu's out right now, but it'd be like Bodie Cahoon and Teddy Rizak? Fours? Yeah. That's a really loaded room, Trev. Like really loaded room. And that's why I said last year the linebacking core was super underrated and was one of the best players in one of the best groups in the country. And I have a feeling they're going to be recognized as such when all the preseason magazines and stuff come out. I feel about this room like I felt about the running back room last year, Trev. I was adamant that this is going to be an elite group. I know that people aren't going to rank it that way, and I think this is an elite group, and I think we saw that in the postseason. We saw them on the same field with the Ohio States and the Georgias and the Penn States where, athletically they took a backseat to nobody and made some pretty big plays. Yeah. So that's why they're my number one. So to recap, Trev, 5 defensive end, 4 safety, 3 defensive tackle, 2 cornerback, 1 linebacker. Now, we're going to get to the offense next, but keep this in mind, folks. We want to hear from you guys. And I got to say, the first guy to step up and give his rankings was the USC fan, Roger Dodger. So first of all, respect Roger. Second of all, Notre Dame fans, let's go. Let's step up. We want to hear your rankings. So when we get to the offense, I want you guys to give us what you guys think of your rankings, and then let us know what you think of ours. Hey, here's why I think I'd put corners number 1. Would love to hear some of that feedback from you guys as well, because I don't think these are givens, Trev. Like, these aren't ones where I'm going to sit here and debate with you for an hour because you want to put the D tackles lower or higher, the safeties higher or lower, or corner 1 or 2. It's like when you're really talented, which I think this team is, you can have some debates about where they should be ranked. And honestly, you want there to be some variation, because if it's just no-brainer to easy place in 1 through 5, it means that there's one spot that's definitely not as good as another one. And I think it makes it a little bit more challenging to discuss this. So that's what I'm very much looking forward to as we kind of get to this. So I am very much looking forward to that. So we're going to get to the offense next, but before we do, folks, do us a favor, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. If you've thought about like, hey, I'd love to support you guys beyond just watching, obviously check out our YouTube or our podcast channels. That's always a great opportunity for us to continue to drive our awareness and alertness, and the revenue stream is much bigger than the one at YouTube. You can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify, whoever. Just type in Irish Breakdown, hit that subscribe button. And if you haven't done so, we would really appreciate a 5-star review, just letting us know what you like about our show and why you listen to what we do. And then, of course, the best way always to be a part of what we're doing is to be on the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. I've dropped a lot of different intel pieces the last couple of days about recruiting. There was one about Javian Osborne last night. I dropped another big recruiting It was based on all the visitors are going to be on campus this week. Huge week for Notre Dame. So you're going to want to check that out as well. So we just did the top five position rankings on defense. Up next is coming up the offense. But first, we did want to thank you guys for being subscribers and loyal listeners and watchers of the Irish Breakdown podcast. Second group, Trevor, the offense. And I was certain we were going to have a difference of opinion on this one. A reminder, this is based on where they are now. Who's on the roster now? Who's healthy now? So if a guy's injured, he's not part of that group now. If a guy's not on the team, he's not part of it now. If they had to go play a game tomorrow, we're evaluating based on that. So who is part of the team now, what we know about this team now. And then we'll sort of reevaluate after the spring. We learn a few more things, and then we'll kind of reevaluate again as we get closer to the fall. So, Trevor, this one I thought was – and initially we did have a slight difference of opinion. We had one that was flipped, but I was kind of forgetting about an injured player and, projecting someone that's not here yet. And so then I ended up flipping it, which got us to having the same five. So I'm going to let you kick off, Trev, because there's nobody that I've ever done a show with that likes talking about the tight ends more than my dude Trevor. So I got to let me know, Trev. I want to hear, number one, why are they five? I want to know, is that cause for concern? And, just kind of how you see that room playing out right now.
Yeah, you guys know me, and I love the tight end position for a multitude of different reasons. One, I think just being a Notre Dame fan, historic list of tight ends that have gone through Notre Dame's program. But on this list, they are fifth for me for a couple of different reasons. One, a lot of the room as a whole is relatively unproven. The most proven guy coming back, honestly, that you could make the argument for from a just pure numbers standpoint is Ty Washington. I still think it's Eli Raridan, but I think Ty Washington might have a few more touchdown catches in him by like one or two. But here's the thing for me. Eli Raridan is slotted to be the number one tight end on this roster right now, which ceiling-wise, you're talking about a 6'7", 250-pound guy that brings a lot of ability after the catch. And that's something that Notre Dame needs at tight end. Had a little bit of it last year, but Mitchell Evans was still battling back from his ACL. But sticking on the same track of ACL injuries, that is my pause with Eli Raridan. He's got to stay healthy. Injuries, unfortunately, the last couple of seasons has decimated this room. There was a comment yesterday when Sean and I were doing the show about, Mike Denbrock, and is there cause for concern with how he's handling the tight end room? And there's a lot of issues that gone on in that room that just was out of his control. He inherited a tight end room that their number one guy, Mitch Evans, was battling back from an ACL injury. You had a guy in Eli Raridan who had his history of ACL injuries. You have a guy in Kevin Bauman who had his fair share of ACL injuries. And so there's a lot of different injury history that's spread out throughout this room. So then you look at what is the state of this room today. You have Eli Raridan at number one. Ceiling's really high, relatively unproven. He played in all 16 games for Notre Dame last year. He really started to catch on second part of the season, but he's your number one guy. Who was slated to be your number two guy, and Cooper Flanagan is rehabbing an Achilles injury right now. So then you look at the makeup of where the room is at right now. You have Jack Larson, another high ceiling guy, really effective as a pass catcher. He had a really good blue gold game last April, but now we have to see that transition over into meaningful snaps on the field in a game. And then after that, you have Kevin Bauman, who's going into his 6th year. Unfortunately for him, he has dealt with a lot of different injuries throughout his time in South Bend. And then outside of that, you have a guy in Henry Garrity who's a walk-on. Good athlete, good football player, but there is a gap between, say, Henry Garrity and an Eli Raridan. And then you look at the two other guys that is going to make up this room. James Flanagan is a highly touted recruit, super talented. He'll be a true freshman, but he's not on campus yet. Then the one guy they got in the portal in the tight end room, Ty Washington from Arkansas, he is also not on the field, or he is also not on the team yet. He's still finishing up, I believe, is he finishing up his degree still with Arkansas right now?
believe so. Yeah. Now I've seen him. He's been at practice a couple times, but he's not practicing with the team right now because he's finishing up his degree. Correct.
Okay.
He's a true senior at Arkansas, I believe.
All right. So you go and you look at the makeup of this room. One, in comparison to the rest of the position groups, they are the most depleted. I would say in comparison, the offense is working with a little bit more of a skeleton crew than what the defense is working with. And I think the tight end room embodies a lot of what that is. Now, Eli Raridan had a healthy spring predominantly last year. He was dealing with a little bit of a quad injury, but he was fine. He was able to play in the blue gold game and remain healthy for all 16 games of Notre Dame's really long season last year. It's a huge step in the right direction. But now we have to see him do it again, and this time as the guy. Cooper Flanagan's going to be busy rehabbing. And I would say two of the three, I still don't know what role Kevin Bauman's going to play yet, but I would say two of the three guys, young guys that have the potential to make an impact in Jack Larson and James Flanagan. Those are kind of unknown commodities right now for that room. So for all of those different reasons, Brian, that's why I have the tight end room fifth.
This is the one position group, Trevor, where I don't see how anyone could disagree. Like, there's a lot on here. There's really two, especially, that I would say it's hard for me to see how you see that. This is the one more than any other that I say is there, because you talk about your leading returning pass catcher, tight end, is a good football player, and Eli Raridan had 11 catches for 90 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's like not even what Jaden Greathouse did in the second half against Ohio State. And that's your leading returner into position. Now, you and I love Eli Raridan's potential, and we think he's going to have a big year, but the injury question marks and all that. So even if you wanted to say, I'm projecting a big year for Eli Raridan right now, cool, that's fine. Who else is playing at that position? You know, a guy, Ty Washington is not on the team. Cooper Flanagan's not on the team. Your number 2 tight end right now is Kevin Bauman, who has been injured his entire career, is another guy that has very little proven production because of those injuries. He's a guy that you don't know what he can do. He's got 6 career catches for 67 yards and 1 touchdown because of injuries. You've got Jack Larson, a player that I like, but a rising sophomore who didn't play meaningful down last year. And that's it. That's the end of the scholarship tight ends. That's the extent of it. So this group to me has to be 5. I don't know how you can put anybody else above it. So, well, the quarterback, Steve Angeli has more proven production in his career than Eli Raridan does. That's just a fact. Now, I'm not saying Steve Angeli's a better player, but that's the one position group of the entire team that is a major question mark for me because of the lack of depth and just the injury history. There's not a guy outside of Jack Larson that's got a clean injury history. So that's got to be taken into consideration when you're talking about ranking these position groups, and why, to me, it's a no-brainer that he's gonna be there. The tight ends are gonna be there. Now, the next 2, Trev, I think can be a little bit more debatable. And the number 4 group, I initially had quarterbacks number 4, but I flipped it and I've got receivers number 4. And here's the reason why. Because you've really only got one guy that played last year that's a full-time guy this spring. That's Jaden Greathouse. Jordan Faison's full-time when he can be there, but he can't always be there because of lacrosse. And if they played a game tomorrow, you'd say, well, okay, but do they also have a lacrosse game tomorrow? Because that's where he's going to be. So it's a little bit of a nitpick, but you don't have Malachi Fields. If they had to play a game tomorrow, Will Pauling can't play because he's limited this spring. You've got Cam Williams and KK Smith, and then the freshman group. And, to me, this group is going to go up, and Micah Gilbert's hurt, which we're not able to get into, but he's not practicing right now and won't be practicing this spring, and I don't anticipate him playing in the blue gold game. But we'll find more about that this weekend. So this is a group that's very thin on numbers for an 11 personnel group, and outside of really one guy, there's just not a lot proven coming back. Because, again, here's who we're not counting as part of this discussion. We're not counting Malachi Fields. We're not counting Will Pauling. we're not counting Micah Gilbert, and we're kind of only half counting Jordan Faison. That's where it comes down to. Now, if they were all here this spring, like the D tackle, we're having a different conversation about the wide receiver room. But that's kind of what goes into it. So I actually like this receiver room, Trevor, but the reality is we're just not going to see the complete version of this group. Like, so when I talk about like looking to 2025 season, the fall, I really like where the receiver room is. But right now, today, April 1st, with all the guys that are not part of the group right now, it's hard for me to put them any higher. I'm going to incorporate them with quarterback at kind of the same time. I'll have you do the same thing. The reason, well, actually, you know what? Let's not do that. Let's just wrap up receiver, and then we can go to why we have quarterback number 3. So let's stay on track, Trev. I want to give you a chance to talk about the receiver room, because I know even before all this, you were a little bit more skeptical of that room even than I was.
Yeah, the receiver room for me, that one was a tough one for me to put it 4 because I know what it will have in August. You know what I mean? But looking at it, state of the state right now, they're running with, similar to the tight end room, a very much skeleton crew. I mean, one of the biggest talking points that we've had about this group the entire spring has been the improvement of what we've seen from Cam Williams at practice. And he played in 1 snap last year, and that was in victory formation against Virginia. That was the one time that he got onto the field. So it's not even a question of he got some garbage time experience. Micah Gilbert did, but now he's hurt, which we'll dive into as the spring progresses. But now you start looking at it in there is a lot of projection that you have to put on this group, even right now, when we talk about the state of this group in the spring. Jaden Greathouse is off doing Jaden Greathouse things. He's picking up where he left off. He was doing the things that he did last spring. But then after that, you have Will Pauling going through at the end of drills because he's going at about 70% working his way back. From what we have seen, Jordan Faison has been at both of the practices that we had availability to, but they've had practices that we haven't gotten to see. And I know Jordan Faison is playing lacrosse because their media page is putting out the highlights that he's been playing.
Right.
You know, and so
with the football team there in their practice uniform. Yes. So clearly he wasn't at practice that day.
Yeah.
So, which he shouldn't be. I'm okay with that, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's, I'm glad you said that because Marcus Freeman talked about it. You've talked about it. And I'm in the same boat is look, when you have a commitment to a team, that's who you're dedicated to for that season. And that's something that I'll always respect Jordan Faison for as he continues to be a dual sport athlete at Notre Dame. But the reality of the situation, what it means for the football team specifically is your second most proven guy on that roster right now in that room is kind of a part-time employee for you. Yeah. And so those are all the factors as to why I put the wide receiver room in 4th. Now, it's going to be fun to revisit this as the offseason progresses and we get into summer and we get into the fall when we get to see, hopefully, Micah Gilbert back out there and Malachi Fields in a Notre Dame uniform and Will Pauling fully healthy. And so leaves a lot of room for excitement, but you and I see the wide receiver room the same.
So here's an interesting thing that when you project to next season, I think you could make a case that some of these guys being out is going to help this group because now Cam Williams is getting a ton of work this spring. KK Smith is getting a lot more work this spring than they otherwise would have if everybody was healthy. So all those reps that Will Pauling is not taking, and at times Jordan Faison's not taking because he's with the lacrosse team, who's taking those? It's KK Smith. It's Elijah Burris. And Elijah Burris is a guy that's been impressive so far. With Micah and Malachi not here, who's getting all those reps? A lot of those reps are going to Cam Williams. So I think this is going to benefit this group come the fall. But right now, it's a little bit of a different deal. Let's talk quarterback, Trev. Talk to me about why you had quarterbacks ranked ahead of the wide receivers.
So for me, again, like Brian said, these are the two position groups, wide receiver and quarterback, that I think has the most room for debate on the offensive side of the ball. And yes, I know that there's not a starter that has been named yet, which is a big detriment to why they're ranked where they're ranked. And why if somebody was adamant that they need to be 4th and not 3rd, I would hear some of that out. But you look at the reality of the situation of the quarterback room right now, and the thing that I love about them is consistent with what we've talked about this entire offseason. The question about the quarterback competition is not if person A, B, or C will lead them back to the playoffs. It's a question of how far each person will lead them once they get there. I'm fully confident that whether it's Steve Angeli, Kenny Minchie, or CJ Carr, they will get Notre Dame back to the playoffs. And honestly, I'd go as far to say as I think all three of those guys would lead them to consecutive home game bids, like hosting a first round of a playoff game. Now, when you go and you look at this competition as a whole, they're doing all the things that you want to see and that we've broken down. We wanted to see Kenny take more charge and be more assertive in getting himself in the rotation and drills. He's doing that. You wanted to see CJ Carr have a little bit of that same prowess. He's doing that. You hear some of the media session things about what you hear about Steve Angeli being the veteran in the room and passing down some of the knowledge that he learned from Sam Hartman and Riley Leonard, and they're all doing those things. Brian talked about it in one of the shows where, yes, CJ had a better day than Kenny, but that's because CJ was putting the ball right here and Kenny was putting the ball right here. Both catchable footballs, but that's the margin for error in this competition, which is why for me they're third, because unlike other seasons, it's not a significant drop-off between guy 1 and 2. It's not. And so, yes, there is no starter named, which this is the only position group on the entire team that you can say that. There is nobody on offense or defense outside of quarterback that has not played multiple games as a starter. And so that is an interesting conversation when you have that discussion, comparing it to the wide receiver room where they have guys like Jaden Greathouse, who's currently here in the spring. But I look at this room as a whole, and whether it's one of those three guys, I'm confident they go 11-1. The question is how far they can take them into the playoffs. Whereas the reason why I rank the wide receiver room a little bit lower as of right now is if they go into the fall and they only have Jaden Greathouse and Jordan Faison, and you're relying on guys like Cam Williams to step up, that's a lot more shaky of a conversation than being in the spring saying, well, it's going to be one of CJ Carr, Kenny Minchie, or Steve Angeli. And that to me was a differentiator. That's why I put quarterbacks as my third-ranked team. Brian, what about you, man?
The whole group's there. Everybody's healthy, and there's no position right now where competition is greater than that position right now. Like, it's a deep room. It's a talented room. Yes, it's unproven, and that's why it's not higher on this list. Because if all three of these kids had a year of experience under their belt, then, we're having a different conversation with this one, Trev. But when I look at this group, I see, you've got a kid that I grade as a 5-star player in CJ Carr, out there battling, performing well. You have a guy that I graded out as a top 100 recruit coming out of high school in Kenny Minchie with top 50 upside, playing as well as he's played since he's been in Notre Dame. And then you've got a guy in Steve Angeli who has some experience that we get reminded of every time we have a conversation about him. Started in a bowl game that they won. What was it, 40-8? Had a 78% completion percentage. Came off the bench against Penn State last year, let him down to a field goal, all those type of things. And so you do have some level of experience there. Plus you have Blake Hebert. Plus you have Anthony Rizak. So you have all 5 of your quarterbacks are here and practicing, and there's a lot of talent in the room. The unprovenness is honestly why it's as low as it is. But I would be okay. So like somebody in the chat, my guy Jason Smith in the chat said he would put receivers ahead because Greathouse 1-for-1 is better than anything, more proven than receivers. That's fair. And I wouldn't necessarily say if you want to have the receivers ahead of the quarterbacks, that's a big reason. I mean, part of the reason I initially did have the receivers ahead. That's a fair thing to look at. The reason that I look at the two is because right now the receiving core can't really have a complete unit right now. Yes, Greathouse is a dude. I think most of us agree on that. But what you don't have in this particular situation, Trev, is your entire starting lineup. And depending on what day you're there and you're evaluating the receiver room, you may not even have Jordan Faison. And so that's really what it comes down to for me, is just that, where if Notre Dame had to play a game tomorrow, they'd have enough for a starting quarterback, a backup quarterback, a third-string quarterback, a fourth-string quarterback, and a fifth-string quarterback. And that's one of the things that separates it a little bit for me. But if you want to say, well, look, there's nobody at quarterback that that has the experience that Jaden Greathouse has, that's fair. That's a fair thing for you to say. This is why I'm going to put the receivers higher. Not going to push back on that at all. Not going to push back on that at all. So that's kind of where I'm at with this, Trev. I'm comfortable with that group being 3 and 4. 2 and 1. I'm surprised, Trev, that there's been some variance in 2 and 1 in the chat. There are some people that have a different 2 compared to a different 1. And so that's where we're going to go next. So let's go with your number 2 group right now, Trev. Let's have a talk about it. Who's your number 2 group right now in this spring?
Number 2 for me right now is the offensive line. And I know that's going to be interesting because it kind of caveats some of what I talked about on the defensive line. I talked about how many questions the defensive end group had. And there are a lot of questions with the offensive line group, but I think you look at it in a little bit different of a light. Because the question around the defensive end position is, who do you have? The question around the offensive line is, where do you put them? Because the reality of the situation is you look at the offensive line and they return 5 guys who all started in 2024 at one point or another. They return Anthony Knapp. They return Billy Schrouth. They return Charles Jagasaw, Emil Wagner, and Ashton Craig. An argument could be made that you could build a starting offensive line from just the guys that you had starting from last year from left to right. You could go Knapp, Schrouth, Craig, Jagasaw, Wagner. And all 5 of those players started last season. So then you get into the question of, hey, Trev, why'd you put them at number 2? We both did. And for me, I look at that and I say, okay, well, yes, you have those 5 guys. But some of the questions for me are, can other players make a push? Can Sullivan Absher push to be a starting interior lineman? One of the guards or center? Most likely right guard, but again, it depends on where they put Billy Schrouth. Because Billy Schrouth started last year as the right guard and then moved to left guard. How healthy will Ashton Craig be? It's another big question. Because
that's part of the reason that to me that it's tough for me to put them number 1 because you can't do the lineup that you're talking about right now.
Yes.
Because right now you don't have Anthony Knapp. And yeah, so keep going, Trev.
You don't have Anthony Knapp right now. Billy Schrouth is playing on somewhat of a pitch count. Emil Wagner is practicing somewhat on a pitch count. And that's where it separates for me.
Yeah.
Is the only offensive lineman that you have right now that are practicing full go. Ashton Craig is still working his way back from injury. The only offensive lineman that you have practicing full go right now that is probably a bona fide day 1 starter is Charles Jagasaw. And we're still not 100% confident where he's going to be. It will most likely be at right guard. But that is not a for sure thing.
Sure.
The other players in that mix, like I said, can Sullivan Absher push to be a starting guard? Can Gerby Lambert push to be a starting tackle? What is Joe Otting going to continue to do in the offseason with Ashton Craig out at center? And so there's a lot of question marks here, but the thing that I love is they do return experience. They do return a lot of talent. That room as a whole, whether you're talking about the starting offensive line or the rotation, and this is all before Will Black gets on campus. Right. And so my thing with not putting the O-line at first is there's just a lot of moving pieces, but all of those pieces have the potential to have a really great season in 2025. Yeah. It's just figuring out where to plug and play.
I would argue that right now, I would say you could make a better case that they deserve to be 3rd than they deserve to be number 1. Just because, as you mentioned, no Anthony Knapp, no Billy Schrouth, who's limited. I still count Emil for right now's rankings because Emil's not injured. They're just limiting his reps because of how much he played last year. If they had to play a game tomorrow, Emil's playing and he's fine. I don't know that Billy Schrouth is fine because he's coming back from a knee injury. I don't know that he would play in a game tomorrow and be able to play at a high level. But think about this, Trev. Even with all the things that you just said and all of it I agree with, you could say, okay, guys that right now are healthy in here. So even though Emil's limited, he's limited just because of volume. He played and this is what Joe Rudolph said. He's like, played 1,000 snaps. That's why we're holding him back. He's not injured. It's just he got a ton of work last year. So you could say, with the group that I have right now, I could have this starting lineup left to right. Wagner or Lambert. Trying to think of Absher, Otting, Jagasol, Wagner or Lambert. So let's just say we're going to leave Emil at right. You could have a starting offensive line of Gerby Lambert, of Sullivan Absher, of Joe Otting, of Charles Jagasol, and Emil Wagner right now. That's not a bad offensive line. Like, Joe Otting's a good football player. And let's be honest about something else, too. I would hope that Notre Dame eventually allows Anthony Knapp to get some snaps to see if he's at all comfortable snapping the football. Like, just to see if the kid can snap at all. Part of the reason that they're not in an apparent rush to cross-train him at center is there's a lot of faith in Joe Otting. So that's why they are putting Sullivan Absher there, because he's more of an emergency center as opposed to someone that's battling for that job. And they do like what Cam Herron has done as a young guy so far. So I think that's part of the conversation too, Trev, is that's still a pretty good group. And then in rotation, you've got Styles Prescott, who I graded as a 4-star recruit, Peter Jones, who I graded as a 4-star recruit. You'd still have Matty Augustine, who I graded as a 4-star recruit, Owen Streebing, who's 6'8", 300 pounds, 4-star recruit, Cam Herron, a guy that I gave 4-star upside to. That's your depth. Even with and we didn't mention Christopher Terrick's out. Think of that. Like, that's where you start to say, like, you have to think Joe Rudolph sucks as a coach to think this line is going to be worse than it was last year. Facts. And I don't think he sucks as a coach. Like, what makes me think that Anthony Knapp, if he puts Knapp at left tackle, which I don't think he should, I've said that. You really think Anthony Knapp's going to regress? Yeah, but Riley Leonard bailed him out. I understand that. You think he's going to regress in year 2? There's nobody that whatever you think about Joe Rudolph, name me the guy that started and played on the offensive line this year that regressed from the year before. You can't. Coogan was better. Rocco was better. Billy was better. Before the injury, Billy was arguably your best lineman. Emil steps into the lineup, does well, and he gets a true freshman who I don't think should be playing left tackle to start 15 games for a team that went 14-1. So, I mean, could he coach the unit to reach his full potential? He's got to prove that to me, especially in pass pro. But it's like a lot of the debates we have. I feel like we immediately, like, here's where it is, and then we immediately, go to our corners. And let me go to my extremes of Joe Rudolph is the worst coach in history, and then this Joe Rudolph has never done anything wrong in his life. And then we start lobbing grenades back and forth at each other. Right? Like, Joe Rudolph has to prove to me that he can coach a Joe Moore Award-winning unit that can dominate in both phases of the game. He's got to prove that to me, because he showed me some really good stuff last year in the run game. Pass pro needs a lot of work. But they did just go 14-2 with this offensive line. And if you think Riley Leonard saved them 3 losses, he saved them some plays. He didn't save them 2 to 3 losses because of his escapability. We've just kind of gone to some extremes. So for me to act like with that talent that this offensive line is going to struggle, I just can't go there with you. If you want to say, I don't know if he's going to get the most out of this group, that's fair. And that is my big concern for Joe Rudolph is, can you make this offensive line a unit that carries this team like it's capable of? That's a fair question. But only being 85% of that is still one of the 10 best offensive lines in college football. Because I think the maximum potential for this group is to be the best or second best offensive line in all of college football, is the potential this group has. That's what he's got to prove to us. So let's make sure the narrative is being discussed in the proper format with the legitimate concerns we have about Joe Rudolph. Legitimate concerns we have. But it's like with everything else. It's a legitimate concern at a much higher level than we've been at in the past. This isn't Jeff Quinn conversation where he may tank the offensive line. Jeff Quinn's one of the most decent human beings I've ever met in the coaching profession. Just wasn't a very good offensive line coach. That's not the debate with Joe Rudolph. It's, is he good or is he excellent? He's at least proven he's good. Now let's see if he can be excellent. That's the question that we have about Joe Rudolph. And he needs to answer that one positively and be closer to excellent than he is to good, because this is a fan base that was spoiled by one of the best in the business for much of the last decade in Harry Hiestand. And so that's the question mark. But this is still a talented group that it's like, this guy's not going to ruin this group. He may not put the line out there that I want and that I ideally think would be best, but he's not going to. This line's not going to suck. And if it does, I ain't going to say what. I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't advocate for people losing their jobs.
Sure.
And I was about to do that to make a point, and I don't want to do that legitimately, because that's not what we do here. But
Sure.
You get the point. That's a major underachievement. This is still a talented room. And the list of guys think about this. Gerby Lambert, 5-star recruit, left to right. Sullivan Absher, 4-star recruit. Joe Otting, 4-star recruit. Charles Jagasol, 5-star recruit. Emil Wagner, 4-star recruit, that I gave a 5-star upside to. That's your starting lineup right now with guys that are healthy. And right now.
Oh yeah, man. If you told me, let's just say we had this conversation in August, start of fall camp, and that's, we got intel. It's like, hey, this is just what the starting five is going to be. It's like, all right, let's roll. You bring up a really good point, Brian. And look, you have to have the conversation with all of these position groups of what the frame of reference is. And it's not, man, what does the offensive line have to be? What does the D line have to be? What does the wide receiver rotation have to look like to get Notre Dame to the playoffs? And if that is your mentality, there is a part of me where I get it, because for the better half of a decade at Notre Dame, the majority of the years, that was the conversation, is what do they have to do to make it back to the playoffs? But the conversation that we're having now is it's a different setting. It's what do they need to do to make it back to the college football playoff semifinals? That is such a much better conversation to have than, man, can they find a way to go 10-2, 11-1, or possibly undefeated to make it back to the playoffs? We know this team's going to make the playoffs. It's now to a degree of how far they're going to make it. Like, I get it. I also think Anthony Knapp projects better on the inside. I think there's better candidates on this team, and will have better candidates on this team come the summer at left tackle. With that being said, Notre Dame was 14-1 with Anthony Knapp as their left tackle. There's worse spots to be in. I mean, it's a spoil of riches, man, and that's a really good spot to be in if you're a Notre Dame fan. It really is.
So let's talk number one. And this is a group that I think is the best room in the country at their position, and that's running backs. This is the number one. So we're going to, when we're all done here, Trev, kind of breaking down the offense and defense, we're just going to kind of go over our top 10 of all of them together, just to have a little bit of fun as we wrap it up. And this is going to be my number one group overall as well. And it's not really one that, you can debate it, but I'm not going to partake in that debate. You know what I'm saying? It's like you have fun with that debate. I'm just going to sit over here in it's a no-brainer. Because, look, what did we talk about earlier? Okay, do you have star power? Yes, you do. You have big-time star power. You have a first proven star power in Jeremiah Love. Okay, do you have depth? You not only have depth, you have multiple guys at your position group that, if their number was called, could go for 1,000 yards this year. Jadarian Price almost did that last year on very limited carries in a 16-game season. But if he's your number one, it's like if you remove any of these guys, this is still one of the 5 to 8 best running back rooms in all of college football. If you remove Jeremiah Love, it's still one of the 5 to 8 best running back rooms in college football. You add him, it's number one. You remove other guys, it's still arguably number one. At the lowest, it drops down to 2. I think you could make a case that if you removed if you removed Jadarian, it drops below Penn State because of the proven nature of their 1-2 punch. Or Jadarian is proven, but it doesn't mean it's going to stay there. Because if Aeneas was thrust into that number 2 role, or Keegan was thrust in that number 2 role, or Jabron was even kind of put into a number 2, number 3 role because somebody else got promoted, you still have one of the 2 to 3 best running back rooms in college football. But if you remove your 1,000-yard rusher, it's still, to me, a top 5 room. That's how loaded they are at running back. You've got Jadarian. You've got Kedron, you've got Aeneas, you've got Jabron, and you've got Nolan James Jr. You don't want to ever have to test that. Let's be honest, because you don't ever want to lose the best returner back in the country, in my opinion. But that just speaks to the volume, or I mean, the depth of the talent in this room. I mean, there's been years in the past where Nolan James Jr. stepping into your two deep, at worst third running back, the minute he steps foot on campus. Recently, that's true. Like maybe during Marcus Freeman's tenure, that might have been true. Probably go back to the end of Kelly's tenure. Like he would have stepped in and been like right behind Kyron Williams, at worst the number 3 back in 21 and 22. Excuse me, 20. And in 19, he definitely would have played a bunch, because when Tony Jones Jr., your starter, got hurt, you didn't really have anything else. I mean, they went through a whole game against Georgia and played like one back because they were so banged up at the position. They didn't want to burn Kyron Williams' red shirt, which I still think was a mistake not to play him at all. You had 4 games you could have played him, but that's a different story for a different day. Brian Kelly never forgave him for dropping a pass against Louisville in the opener, but whatever. So this room is absolutely loaded, man, absolutely loaded. And here's what separates the Notre Dame room from the Penn State room. You could argue Penn State can match Notre Dame 1 for 2, top 2. You could argue that. There's more career production in Penn State. They both went for over 1,000 yards last year. Now, again, different context, because, they didn't have a quarterback that rushed for 900 yards. That kind of adds a little bit to the challenge of getting 2 backs to 1,000 yards, is when your quarterback rushes for 900 and was it 906 in 17 touchdowns. It's going to be hard for your 1-2 punch to be better than that. But when you look at, like, for example, Nicholas Singleton, who's in what he did this year, he was 172 carries, 1,099 yards, 6.4 per carry, and had 12 touchdowns. Compare that to Jeremiah Love, who on 163 carries, so that would be 9 fewer carries, had 26 more yards. So 6.4 per carry for Singleton, 6.9 for Jeremiah, and he had 17 touchdowns compared to 12 for Singleton. And then you look at Katron Allen, who obviously had significantly greater production than what Jadarian Price had. He had 746 yards and 7 touchdowns, Jadarian did, and Katron Allen had 1,108 yards and 8 touchdowns. Well, Katron Allen had 220 carries and Jadarian had 120. So in 100 fewer carries, so that'd be 254 plus 108. So that's 362 more yards on 100 more carries. So you'd have to give Jadarian Price 100 more carries, and he'd have to average in the 3s to just match Katron Allen. If he stayed at his current rate, like, think about, you want to talk about how good you are. If Jadarian Price, so he averaged this past season 6.22 yards per carry. If he had the same number of carries as Katron Allen, he'd have finished with 1,368 yards. Think about that for a second. And if you look at his touchdown rate, so let's see here, 7 divided by 120, and you multiply that times 220, he'd have had 13 touchdowns to Katron Allen's 8. So pound for pound, snap for snap, that room was by far better than, was far more productive on a per snap basis. I mean, put it like this: Nicholas Singleton was their leading guy from a yards per carry standpoint. He was 0.17 ahead of Jadarian Price, who was Notre Dame's by far number 2. He was 0.51 below Jeremiah Love. So he's closer to Jadarian Price, who's their number 2, than he is to Notre Dame's number 1. He was their number 1. It's about volume. It's about usage. And then their number 2 running back was a freshman, Corey Smith, who had 22 carries for 152 yards. Notre Dame had Aeneas Williams, who had 34 carries for 219 yards. And then Kedron Young had 21 carries for 116 yards. He was the number 4 running back this past year. So this room is absolutely loaded, and everybody's healthy right now. I mean, everybody's out there practicing. They're limiting Jeremiah a little bit from a rep standpoint this spring, but that's only because of the volume he played. He's fine. He's healthy. He's good to go. So it's such a loaded room, Trev. It's just an embarrassment of riches. And I can't wait to see what this group does this year. And it's going to be a challenge for Jawan Sider to utilize the whole room and keep everybody kind of in the groove, and don't wear certain guys down, but also need to make sure that you're building around certain guys. It's not as easy as it may come across, honestly, but it's a great problem to have. Every coach in the country would love to have that problem. Oh, gee, I've got too much talent. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to play everyone. Like life is tough for you, but this is the number one group on this team, and it's the number one group, in my opinion, in the entire country at running back. We said that it would be, we said we thought it was going to be one of the best last year. We said we wouldn't trade this room for anybody in the country last year. The nation needed to know. The nation knows now. This running back is excellent. This running back room is excellent. I am curious to see what it's going to look like without Riley. How do things change and all that? But it's exciting to think about how this group is going to be used and what they're going to be this year, Trev.
Oh man, I mean, yeah. Look, this has to be the no-brainer number one on offense to me, and for just all the reasons that you listed out. I mean, this group returns 2,200 rushing yards and 27 rushing touchdowns, and I didn't include Riley Leonard in those numbers, obviously. I mean, that's a loaded room, man. And that's before Kedron Young saw meaningful carries. That's before Nolan James gets added to the rotation. That was with Jabron Payne sitting out for the season with a torn ACL, as unfortunate as that was. And so you start looking at the makeup of this room. I mean, just if they had Jeremiah Love coming back, just him, you look at the state of the room, and I'm just like, I mean, yeah, they're probably at least second on the offense right now. Everything else given for all the other things that we talked about. Then you add J.D. Price, you add Aeneas Williams, you add Kedron Young, you add Jabron Payne, you add Nolan James, running out of breath, listing off all the people that are just in this room alone, and so it's just an embarrassment of riches, like you said. And above it all, in previous years, you lose a guy like Dylan McCullough to the NFL. It's like, oh gosh, who's going to come in and replace him? You replaced him with the coach that's in competition with your room from last season for having the best running back room in college football. I mean, it's just going from Dylan McCullough to Jawan Sider is more so the icing on the cake for me. It's not what pushed it over the top, but it's just along with the loaded talent in the room. You went from amazing college running back coach to amazing college running back coach. So for me, it's just, this was the no-brainer number one on offense. It's also the no-brainer number one for me. Spoiler for when we get to the entire team section, because man, this group is special.
Yeah, it is. It is. So before we wrap up here, Trev, let's do our 10-1. We didn't talk about this one, so this is the one we're not sure of where we're going to be. So let's just go. Do you have your 10-1?
Mm-hmm.
Let's just go 10, and you list yours first, and I'll list mine, and then we'll just go 9, and you first, I'll go second. And then if there's anything that stands out, we can kind of ask each other questions about why they had them at the end. So this will be a little bit more fun, because this one we didn't discuss beforehand. So who is your number 10 room on the team?
10 for me is tight end for all the reasons that we listed off. So
what's your 9?
9 for me is safety. I will say 7 through 9 for me.
You had defensive end lower than safety in the 1 through 5.
I did. No, you're right. I did. I was getting ready to say my 7 through 9 is debatable. Or wait, for my 1 through 5, I put. No, you're right. Yeah, I had DNs lower than my safeties.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, mine are up for debate. I'm not going to lie. I made this list like as the show was going on, and I was evaluating it as a room was going on. So
would you say DN then would be 9?
Yeah. I'll swap DN and say, yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So 9 for me, DN. 8 would be safety.
9 is DN for me as well.
Okay.
So give yours and I'll give mine, give yours and then mine, and we'll do it that way. So your 8 is safety.
Mm-hmm.
I went wide receiver. I don't feel great about this one, like just because my next 3 I have a little bit of debate on. And I'll tell you why here when I'm done with it. 7,
Wide receiver.
6.
Quarterback.
Okay. I had 7 quarterback. I had 6 safety. 5.
Defensive tackle.
Same. 4.
O-line.
Okay. I had corner. 3.
Corner.
O-line. 2.
Linebacker.
Same. 1 running back.
Running back.
So here's where I was at, Trev, with why I put the safety group where I did. Because if I looked at the 3, receiver, quarterback, safety is the one position group that they have the most proven player of all of them. And that's really what it came down to for me. They also have the least, compared to receiver, the least injuries plus guys out. They have 1 guy out. Whereas the other position groups, so like when I think about the health of a group right now, everybody but Jalen Stroman, actually there's 2. Everybody but Jalen Stroman and Brandon Logan are getting work right now. Where at corner, you got 2 pretty important pieces that aren't getting any work right now in Dallas Golden and Mark Zachary, at a group that's otherwise pretty thin. When I look at receiver, you don't get your Malachi's not getting work. Micah Gilbert's not getting any work right now. Those are 2 pretty important pieces to this puzzle, and then some other guys that are limited. So that really is we're going to see work getting done from all the safeties except of guys we expected to play. I didn't expect Brandon Logan to kind of come in and play as a freshman. So it's really just looking at it from the standpoint of Jalen Stroman is really the one guy you're missing. Where at receiver, you're missing Malachi, you're missing Micah Gilbert, and you're kind of missing Will Pauling because he's playing and practicing, but he's not 100%. And he's not, like if they were playing a game on Saturday, he's not playing, I don't believe. Or at least he's not playing much. Be curious to see what we might see from him on this Saturday's practice. I'm very, very curious to see about that. So that's why I went them number 5. O-line versus corner, it really also came down to still continue just the depth. And, Leonard Moore's a stud. I think Christian Gray's outstanding, but I think Charles Jagasaw is also a stud. And Emil and because I count Emil, he counts as part of that too. But I'm not going to really push back on that too much because that's the one where that was my second toughest area for me. But it's just the depth there. Because again, with that corner, you can still go with a Styles Prescott in the second group. You can go with, we didn't even mention Devin Houston earlier, but you've got Styles Prescott, you've got Cam Herron, you've got some pretty good football players there. If you're just looking at and if we counted Billy Schrouth, because if you're going to count Will Pauling, then you got to count Billy Schrouth. And then all of a sudden it's a little bit different, but I don't. So that's kind of where I'm at, Trev. I was kind of torn on that. Again, if we're talking just starting lineup, then I'm going with corner. But when we include the depth, that's what continues to hurt corner for me for right now. I think that's going to change by the time we get to the fall. And we'll have a much better read on where Carson Hobbs is and where Creed Thomas is when we get through the spring. But right now, those guys are both still question marks for me. So that's where we're at, Trev, 1 to 10. That's good. That's a fun list. I'm looking forward to, and we wanted to do this now because we wanted to kind of get a state of the things now. But then when we do a list later, we've kind of got something to point back to be like, okay, this group has gone up for me. This group has gone down for me. And then why? Why has your perception changed about this room? Like Trev, man, you had, the receivers number 4 in the middle of spring. You've got them here now. What's changed? Maybe spark some fun conversation here as we get out of the spring and get closer to the fall and just kind of where they stand. So that's going to do it for this, Trev, but we're not done yet, man. We got a mailbag coming up and I'm very much looking forward to that because we've got some really good questions today. And I missed all of you yesterday. I went Saturday without talking to y'all, Sunday without talking to y'all. And I'm like, I'm going to get to be with my guys and my gals on Monday. Our TCF, Sean and I had an awesome topic planned, and I kind of pulled a little bit of owner's rank because I wouldn't let Sean and Trev talk about the topic that Sean came up with it, and I think it's going to be a great topic, but it's one of those ones where I wanted to talk about it. So they kind of impromptu put yesterday's shows together, and it was a great show. So props to the guys, but that's because I pulled a little bit of the owner's card and was like, no, I want to talk about that topic. So we're going to hold on to that one until next week. But you guys did a great job yesterday. But Do us a favor, folks. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you listen to. But of course, as always, the best way to support what we're doing at Irish Breakdown is to sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Trevor, it is mailbag time. And we had a couple guys jump in with a lot of mailbag questions. So we'll get to many of those we can. If you want to get some more mailbag questions in, go ahead and throw them in now. You can put an MB on there, which lets us know it's a mailbag, not just normal chatter from the show. If you want to, you can also put the mailbox emoji on there, which helps us see it. And then, of course, you can always do a super chat if you want to get your mailbag question in there as well. So all of those methods work for us. So Trevor, Tommy Guns jumped in there and got some really good questions right away. And here's the best part about it. They were football questions.
Oh.
So yes, my dude. So let's get things started right now.
Tommy Guns, what are roughly the top 5 kick returns for touchdowns in terms of momentum swings and such since Bye-Bye Rocket?
Since then, so does since then include like not counting that? So since that one against Michigan in '89, what are some ones? So if I'm thinking about momentum swings, you have to go to 1990. There were 2 of them in 1990 that were actually, you know what? I don't know that. Let me pull up this box score because I'm not sure if Rocket's touchdown against Tennessee, like Rocket had a long return against Tennessee, but I don't know if he scored on that punt return that he had. Yeah, he returned it to the 11. That was a big one that he had then. So, but 1990 for sure, thinking of momentum swings, the 1990 kick return against Miami was a big one. And I'm trying to think of what the score was. I'm trying to find some of these box scores. But Miami obviously had I think it was coming out of the first half, I believe, is when that one when that one went through. I think it was kicking off the second half. I got to go back and look at that one. Dang it. I'm drawing a bit of a blank here. But anyways, a very hotly contested game. And Rocket comes back. He actually stumbled when he caught it and then takes it over 90 yards for the touchdown because he was just he was unbelievable. The most impactful punt return he ever had for a touchdown should have been 1990 Orange Bowl against Colorado, but they called the clip. There was a minute left, and he returns it. Game was 10-9 game. He returned it back for a touchdown. That was a huge one. Just off the top of my head, some of the biggest ones, Julius Jones against Nebraska back in 1999, right? Wouldn't that be 1999? Let me pull that up. What's crazy, Trev, is we think of that great Nebraska Notre Dame game from 1989, and that the Nebraska won 27-24 in overtime. But Notre Dame's comeback was sparked by 2 special teams touchdowns. So Nebraska was winning 21-7 in the third quarter. So they scored a touchdown to go up 21-7. And Julius Jones, who Notre Dame just offered his son, talking about feeling old, he was a true freshman, returned the next kickoff back 100 yards. And it was 21-14 in the fourth quarter. And then Joey Getherall returned a punt 83 yards for a touchdown to tie it. And that's what sent it to overtime. So those were both huge ones.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. I know Allen Rossum had a big one, but I can't remember the circumstance of the game in there. CJ Sanders had a pretty big one against Stanford in 2015. Stanford had taken that opening drive right down the field for a touchdown, and then CJ took it back. Another one that's always pops in my head as far as like a really momentum swing is a big reason why that 05 USC game was close was because of Zbikowski's punt return, which really kind of got Notre Dame going. And so I think that I'm trying to remember what the lead was that gave them a bigger lead, that it was kind of a back and forth game up to that point in time. And then Zbikowski took a punt back. Let me see here. It was 14-14. And then he took that punt back and made it 21-14. So that was a pretty big one as well. Those are just some of the ones that I'm thinking of. And then, I mean, more recently, the Chris Tyree kick return against Wisconsin was huge in 2021. So Notre Dame was beating Wisconsin, and Jack Cohn gets knocked out of the game. He's out. Wisconsin, that next series, sacks Drew Pine, fumbles the ball. Wisconsin gets it, goes on a drive, and they kick a go-ahead field goal at the beginning of the fourth quarter to go up 13-10. And Chris Tyree returns the ensuing kickoff. Was it 96 yards, I think, for a touchdown. That was huge, very huge. And I feel like Vontez Duff had a big one as well. Arnez Battle, I think, didn't Arnez Battle have a big punt return against Florida State a few years ago? Some of y'all need to help me out. Oh, and maybe the biggest one of all, Trev, outside of the 1988, Ricky Waters had the only touchdown for Notre Dame in a 1917 win over Michigan, the Reggie Ho field goal game. The only touchdown Notre Dame scored that game was a long punt return by Ricky Waters. Notre Dame doesn't beat Michigan that day. They don't win the title most likely that year. So that's another one. But that's pre the Bye-Bye Rocket one. So that's why I didn't include that one. But like that one was a big one that's worth mentioning, even though it was after the Bye-Bye Rocket, because the Bye-Bye Rocket one against Michigan didn't come until – that was against Michigan, correct? That was in 89. So that had been Rocket's second year. But yeah, man, that's a good one. So Christopher Galloway mentioned that one, but that one doesn't technically count towards the ones that he's talking about. So if we talk, and then of course, somebody just mentioned it. Who was it? Jay Henry, my guy Jay Henry. College football quarterfinals. Jaden Harrison, 98 yards against Georgia.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big one. It's pretty big.
That one was at the top of my list. You mentioned some of the other ones that were on there. I mean, Zibby's punt return against USC was huge. CJ Sanders against Stanford in 2015 was huge. The only other one that I have, and I'll say this, unfortunately, it was a loss, but in 2009, that's why it's tough to say like momentum swinging, but it was at the point of the game. Golden Tate against Pitt in 2009.
They were about to get blown out if he doesn't have that, Trev.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so the point was that the question wasn't that led to a victory. The question was momentum swing.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, to set the stage for that particular play, it was 27-0. No, what was it? It was, where's the touchdown from Golden? It was 27-16. Notre Dame had just scored a touchdown to make it 27-16. The offense was sputtering a little bit. They were at one point in time were down 20-3. That touchdown made it a 27-22 game. And Notre Dame went for two, didn't get it, but their offense wasn't doing a whole lot. That was definitely a momentum swinging play for sure, even though it didn't result in a win. But it was definitely a momentum swinging return by Golden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. That was one of my favorite Brent Musburger calls. That was fun.
Yeah.
Yep.
I feel like there was another return back then that I'm trying to think of, but I think the one against Michigan State was an INT return. But yeah, the two Nebraska ones were huge too, Trev, but those were also in a loss. That was against number one Nebraska, but you're down 21-7 against the number one team in the country.
Yeah.
And 100-yard kick return and then an 83-yard punt return ties the game. Those sends it overtime. Those are pretty momentum swinging games. You were about to get blown out by Nebraska. Your offense did nothing against Nebraska that day. Those were pretty big momentum swing games.
Did George Atkinson have a kick return for a touchdown against USC in 2013?
Yes, that sparked them. That got them going in that game. They were down 17-7. Let me look at it. They were getting whooped by them pretty good. 17-7, maybe 20-7. Notre Dame USC box score. That was 2011, right? Let's see here. It was 17. It was, where was the score? It was 14. It was 17-0. Trev, they were down 17-0. They had just kicked a field goal with 3:34 left in the first half. And George took the kick back. But here's the thing about that. It made it 17-7, but because they scored so quickly, they were able to get a defensive stop against USC get the ball back, go on a quick drive, and kick a field goal. So it's 17-0 turned into 17-10 going into halftime. And that allowed them to kind of get back in that game. So they ended up losing, but like they were about to get run off the field if George doesn't take that kickback for a touchdown. So yes, that was a big one as well. And he had another. I mean, he had a big one against Navy. Was it Navy? What was the other one that George had a kick return? He had a couple kick returns during his career at Notre Dame. And I'm trying to remember what the other one was. Let me just go here and check this out. Let's see, college. Let's go to his college career. And when did he have special teams? I guess they're not going to show his special teams touchdowns, but yeah, he was a very dynamic returner for Notre Dame. There's no doubt. Very dynamic. So those are some fun ones off the top of our head. It's a good question, Tommy.
Yeah. I am Tenzin, best starting linebacker crew. I think Drake at Mike and Kingston at Will and Osbury at Rover.
Probably be mine too. I don't. If you're going with a 3 linebacker unit, that's probably be mine. I wouldn't push back on you if you wanted to have Jalen Sneed in there somewhere, but just as far as like every down play, that's probably where I would go.
Yeah,
I'm comfortable.
I'm with that. Salty Virginia Peanuts, if the wide receiver position group maximizes its potential this season, where does it rank over the last decade of wide receiver groups?
It has a chance to compete for a top 3 spot. If we're talking in the last decade, so we're going, would that be 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So actually 2015 wouldn't even count if we're talking last decade. So with that being said, it has a chance to be the challenge for what I think the best receiving core of this last decade was, which was 2018. I don't know if this group can have quite as good of a 1, 2, 3 as that group was, but there's way more depth of this from this room. But it has a chance to. I mean, I think Malachi Fields has a chance to be better than what Miles Boykin was. I have no doubt about that. Will he? I don't know, but does he have a chance to be? Yes. Is Will Pauling or Jordan Faison as good as what Chase Claypool was the second half of that year? I don't think so. Is Jaden Greathouse a better player than Chris Fink? Yes. Is he going to be as clutch as Chris Fink was? Remains to be seen, but the end of the season made me think that he's going to be there. Chris Fink was incredibly underrated on that team. Like, so clutch. I mean, you're down 10-0 against USC. At the end of, you're 11-0. You lose that game to USC, you might be out of the playoffs. You're down 10-0. You got nothing going on, and Chris Fink went off. He had 7 catches for, I think it was 126 yards, and he did it all in the first half as that team kind of rallied back, and he sparked the offense to kind of got them going. He finished with, let me see here, 7 catches for 86 yards. Excuse me, not 126. I thought he had more yards than that. But 7 catches for 86 yards, all in the first half. And he caught the touchdown pass that I would argue is the best ball that Ian Book ever threw. That made it 10-7. I mean, that corner route that Ian Book threw against USC in that game was the best ball I've ever seen Ian Book throw. High degree of difficulty, really tight window, great route, just a great ball. And that sparked them a little bit. The problem is that team had no depth. Like the depth on that 2018 team was just, and not that they didn't have depth, they didn't use it. And that was a big frustration of mine on that team. I mean, you had those 3 guys. Your next most amount of catches from a receiver was Michael Young with 7. Just, yeah, it's very frustrating. But I think this group has a chance to rival that one for the best. And if you wanted to include 10 years before and you wanted to go back to 15, again, same deal. I don't know that they're going to have anyone as good as the number 1 on that team, but the depth has a chance to be better. No one's going to be nearly as good as Will Fuller. I don't think anyone's as good as Will Fuller, much less produce like Will Fuller did. But do I think that their number 2 can be better than Chris Brown and their number 3 can be better than Amir Carlisle and their number 4 could be better than Torrey Hunter Jr.? Possibly. They got to prove it, but possibly. I think Torrey Hunter Jr.'s presence on that team made that group a lot better because unlike the 18 team, you actually had 4 guys that were productive on that 2015 team. Because obviously had Will Fuller had his was a 68 catches. Let me pull it up here real quick. 62 catches for 1,258 yards, 14 touchdowns. Chris Brown had 48 for 597. Amir Carlo had 32 for 355 and a touchdown. You had Corey Robinson that had 16 and 200. I sometimes forget about him. But then you also had Torrey Hunter had 28 catches for 363 yards and 2 touchdowns. And let's not forget, he caught the touchdown pass at the end of the Clemson game that put them in position to tie that game. Very underrated member. And yet Corey Robinson was your 5 on that team. That was a loaded receiver room. Can this group be as good as that one? That's going to be tough. That's going to be tough because you don't have that number one dude, and they had depth. But it's got a chance to be as good as 2018, in my opinion. That's who they're more battling against, is that group. What do you think, Trev?
Yeah, I would agree with that from a numbers standpoint. And I've said this before too, as horrible of a season as it was, I think 2016 from a strictly numbers standpoint is a relatively decent referencing point for what this room could put up statistically. I don't think this team goes 4-8 for a smattering of reasons, not just the wide receiver room, but you go back and you look at that year and, EQ, he had 961 yards, averaged 16.6 yards per catch, 9 touchdowns. Torrey Hunter had 521, 13.7 per catch, 3 touchdowns. And I think he got hurt that year. Kevin Stefferson, he had 25 catches. Yep. In 16.
He missed some time. Yeah, he missed some time. I think he missed some time after the Texas game when he got that concussion.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Non-targeting call. I think he missed some games right after that. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, you had Kevin Stefferson on that team. He had 25 catches for 462 yards, averaged 18.5 per catch, 5 touchdowns. CJ Standers had 293 and 2 touchdowns. I mean, it was that room had a lot of depth. It's just unfortunately the team itself wasn't that great as a whole. But 2016's up there for me when we're just talking about the best receiving groups in this decade, just the receiving groups. 18 is the leader for that one for me. I thought about 2019, but really from a number standpoint, outside of Chase Claypool, like the room was just, wide receiver specific. Your next leading receiver on that 2019 team was Cole Kmet, and then wide receivers, it was Chris Fink, who caught 41 for 456 and 4 touchdowns. But Javon McKinley caught 11 passes. 4 of them went for touchdowns.
The only slight caveat that I would add to that is you have to remember that Braden Lindsey had 13 carries for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns on reverses and jets as well. But it still doesn't change the overall point that it was Chase Claypool and then big drop off between everybody else, in my opinion, from what they were.
Yep. And then it was similar in 2021. You had Kevin Austin. It's kind of up at the top. Next was Michael Mayer. And then after that, it was just kind of a flavor of the week almost, it felt like. So,
you know what I think is a very underrated receiving core? It wasn't great, and this group but the 20 receiving core is very underrated.
Yeah,
Javon McKinley had a very underrated season. Ben Skoranek was solid, but Avery Davis had some very clutch plays that season as well. He had a very, very nice season for Notre Dame that year. And that group doesn't get as much talk about, being a really quality group. Not dynamic, not wow, what great playmaker, just steady. And as I've said, Javon McKinley he was big in their big moments. You look at Avery Davis with that huge long grab, and then not only did he have that long grab at the end of the Clemson game that set him up for the final touchdown, he caught the touchdown pass. You know what I mean? And did a great job working to get open to catch that touchdown pass. So that was a very underrated group, without a doubt. It's a good question. Yep. Really good question. We had a couple questions about this. Let's just kind of go here, Trev. JP Buellsfeld, and I'll ask it first. You can speak on it. What are your thoughts on the shocking news that Olivia Miles went to the transfer portal instead of being the number 2 pick in the NBA draft? Let me just say one thing. It's not a given she was going to be the number 2 pick in the draft. That's what she was projected as, but she was going to go in the first round. She was going to go in the first round. What do you say, Trev?
Yeah, Brian, I texted you last night about this. We talked about it a little bit, and it's, shocking news. It's tough to hear, and I don't think it's shocking that she forewent the WNBA draft because high-level women's college basketball players are going to make more money in college than they will on salary in the WNBA. Like Caitlin Clark makes a lot of money. A lot of it is from like endorsements and like the brands that she works with. It's not just from her raw salary for the WNBA. So in that aspect, I'm not surprised she forewent the draft. I was a little bit surprised that she entered the transfer portal and as quickly as she entered the transfer portal. And so for me, that was more of my thoughts. We talk about sometimes like, yes, I understand that Notre Dame's women's team for 4 years in a row now their seasons ended in the Sweet 16. It's an issue in itself. And I'm sure that Coach Ivy is going to do her due diligence to make sure that they make it farther than that this upcoming season. But I don't know, you start talking about lateral moves, and I think it's going to depend on where she ends up because we don't know where that's going to be yet. But who knows? I was shocked that she left Notre Dame because her and Hidalgo as a backcourt duo, or I believed was one of the best, if not the best in the country. And so breaking that duo up to just play it somewhere else in college, I thought was an interesting decision. But who knows?
I know Sean Stiers is probably going to speak on this further, so I don't want to steal too much of his thunder, but it just struck me as like this team, like Sonia Citron made a comment at the end of the game where she talked about like, we just had too much talent. We didn't always know how to, I'm paraphrasing, but didn't necessarily always know how to play together. And I felt like I was excited once Maddie Westbeld came back to see what that team could be. And I never felt like they were able to figure out how they worked best once Maddie came back. Like the Carlin kid wasn't used as much. Like they're trying to be this one team. It's like Kate Koval early in the year. She's starting. They found a role for her. It was a really good role. But then Maddie comes back, and then now they're just trying to get her in spurts, and she just wasn't comfortable. And then you just watch Hannah and Olivia. I don't know that they always played well together. It's like they were always trying to, I just didn't always play really well together. When things would go bad, it was usually Sonia who would have to hit the shot to kind of get things back on track. It wasn't Olivia or Hannah. It was an odd dynamic, and it felt like she just couldn't push the right buttons to get that team going. And like you watch TCU's coach, they're down 9. That's a team basically built entirely through the portal. Most of them were there for a year, and he was able to push the right buttons. But their money player, Haley Van Lith, was just started hitting big shots, and none of Notre Dame's players could hit big shots. That's concerning for me. That 4 years in a row you're in the Sweet 16 with the talent you've had. That's problematic. So there's obviously a lot of things that Coach Ivy's going to have to figure out. The way this season ended was incredibly disappointing. And honestly, I think she'd be getting a little bit more of a pass if they didn't collapse down the stretch of the regular season. Like if they'd have won the ACC and just had a bad day and got beat by Haley Van Lith, who's, played in Final Fours before and has always been a bit of a thorn in Notre Dame's side, whether that was at, TCU or Louisville, that kind of thing. It was just like you could live with that if the season didn't end, the regular season, the tournament didn't end as poorly as it did. It's just like, this is a great upset by a pretty good team, 2 seed or whatever. And it was weird. And you couldn't see the coaching staff push the buttons to get them out of their funk. Every game that the offense started to struggle, there was nothing that Coach Ivy could go to that would fix things. And that's problematic. So now you're going to hopefully have Hannah back. And then, what are you going to do after that? You're going to get Cass Prosper is going to be back. You're going to get Kate Koval hopefully back. You're going to get Leah Macy in, although she's a little bit injured right now, apparently. And then you're going to have to go to you're going to get Kylie Watson back. You're going to get KK Bransford back next year. So that'll be nice. But you're going to need some people to step in and replace some of the scoring that you lost with Maddie and with Olivia and Sonia. But the thing that the not going to the WNBA thing doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, the way that top players are making NIL money, you're taking a pay cut to go to the WNBA right now. Caitlin Clark signed a 4-year contract for over $300,000. She's making 70-something thousand a year. That's it. And so, and you're getting subsidized by the NBA to even get that, for them. So right now, NIL, I mean, college basketball, every female college basketball player should stay as long as she possibly can if she's making big money. Like, why would you leave early? You're taking a pay cut to go to the WNBA. Now, the counter is that a lot of those ladies will then go play overseas and make a lot of money in the offseason. They'll make more money playing overseas in different countries than sometimes this is reportedly than what they're making in the United States. But it's a very interesting dynamic. But I just thought she'd kind of maybe take that money and stay at Notre Dame. And the fact that she's going in the portal, I think, speaks volumes about why this team played the way they played down the stretch. Is they just weren't a team. And it was an incredibly disappointing season to what, there's one point in time, man, I was like, dude, they wanted all the smoke. They had beaten USC. They'd beaten Texas. They had beaten, UConn, and they were the number one team in the country. And just from that moment, just fell off the earth, man. It's, it's a problem.
Yep.
It's a problem. And Sean Davis talked about this. Like, you got to stop asking Maddie Westbeld to cover fives. Like, Maddie's a stretch four that can shoot and go to the basket, and you keep turning her into a center. And that never made sense. And Sean was spot on that. He had texted me that the other day. That didn't make a lot of sense either. So, yeah.
I am Tenzin. Second best offense you've seen, assuming 2019 LSU is number one.
That's a debate. That's a debate for me. You're gonna love this, Trev, because you know how much I hate the triple option. But that's a debate for me between 1995 Nebraska and 2008 Oklahoma. And the reason I kind of lean towards Nebraska is because Nebraska never lost. But people forget this, Trevor. That Nebraska team in 1995, because people think option, they think running the football. They don't think. They scored 52 points a game, that 95 Nebraska team. 52 points a game. They scored 64 against Oklahoma State, 50 against Michigan State, 77 against Arizona State, 35 against Washington State. The only one of only two games all year they scored under 40 against a Power 5 team. 57 against Missouri, 49 against number 8 Kansas State, 44 against number 7 Colorado, 73 against Iowa State. So then you scored 41 against at number 10 Kansas, 37 against Oklahoma, a game you won 37-0, and then you beat number 2 Florida in the title game 62-24. That team had 6 games where they scored more than 50 points and 4 games where they scored more than 60 points. And the only non-quote-unquote Power 4 team they played all year was Pacific, and they only scored 49 in that game. So that game against Pacific dragged their average down. Think about that. So they were 52.4 points per game. That was a very dynamic offense. If it wasn't for the basically getting shut down by Florida in the title game, then I would have gone with 08 Oklahoma. They averaged 51.1 points a game, and that's with them only scoring 14 in the title game. Coming into the title game, they had a 6-game stretch of 58 against K-State, 62 against Nebraska, 66 against A&M, 65 against number 2 Texas Tech, 61 against number 11 Oklahoma State, 62 in the Big 12 title game against number 19 Missouri. Earlier that year, they also scored 45 against Kansas, their only loss of the year. They scored 35 in their loss to Texas. They scored 35 against a ranked TCU team. They scored 55 against Washington, 52 against Cincinnati. So this team scored a ton of points, but then watching them get shut down by Florida in the title game, that dragged them down for me. So the numbers were great, whereas 95 Nebraska scored 62 in the title game against Florida. And that's probably that's what makes them just unreal good as they were. And they did that playing power option football. They weren't a triple option team per se. They were a power option team. They did a lot of stuff out of the like Notre Dame. They did a lot of stuff out of the triple option off the I formation. But that was a holy crap. 52 points a game. That was nuts. Absolutely nuts.
Yeah. No, that's crazy. I wish I could have seen it, honestly. Like they're one of the teams that I wish I could have seen in its prime.
Yeah.
This one's.
You got to one of these days, Trev, when you get your work done early, Just joking. You've got to go look at some YouTube videos of that 95 Nebraska team.
Yeah.
Like man, they were so good, Trevor. It's just ridiculous. I mean, like Lawrence Phillips was their number 3 rusher. He rushed for 547 yards. He played 5 games because he got suspended. Their starting running back, Amon Green, averaged 7.7 yards per carry. Lawrence Phillip averaged 7.7. Their next running back averaged 7.8. Their next running back averaged 6.5. Their quarterback averaged 6.2. And their fullback averaged 5.9 yards a carry. Like, it was ridiculous. And his younger brother, Joel, averaged 8.4 yards per carry because the Makovica brothers were on that team. Like, that was a crazy team, dude. Crazy team. Like, just they averaged. Think about it. They averaged 399.8 rushing yards a game and averaged 7.0 yards per carry. And you knew it was coming. You knew what was coming, and you couldn't stop it. It's unbelievable.
This one's tough for me because it's different now. Like when I was growing up and going through, watching football, it's kind of when offenses started to evolve a little bit, become a little bit more pass heavy than what they had been in recent years. There's a handful of teams that come to mind, man. I mean, 2012 alone as a year had some pretty fun offenses. I mean, Oregon in 2012 was crazy. I mean, you had, Marcus Mariota, you had Kenyon Barner, you had DeAnthony Thomas, you had Josh Huff. I mean, those were good players. I mean, 2012 West Virginia was crazy. Like, their offense was so fun to watch, man. I mean, they had Stedman Bailey had 25 receiving touchdowns that year. Him and both Tavon Austin had 114 receptions, both over 1,000-yard receivers. And then Tavon Austin still to this day had one of the best single-game performances I've seen a football player have. In a 50-49 loss to Oklahoma, he had 82 receiving yards and 344 rushing yards. I mean, that's crazy, and then you start talking about other offenses that I've seen that have just been loaded.
Hold on a second. Because, like, that's not even the craziest game that he had, in my opinion. I'm trying to find the box score. Hold on a second. What year did West Virginia play LSU in football? Do you remember what year that was? Trying to find it.
2010.
All right, I'm trying to find this year. So there was a year where is it? Yeah, Tavon Austin against LSU in a game they got beat. They had 11 catches for 187 yards and had six kick returns for 100 yards. Like, some of the moves he was putting on LSU that day were ridiculous. Talking about the talent on the field that day, you had Tavon Austin on one side, Odell Beckham on the other side at receiver. They also had Stedman Bailey, West Virginia did. Geno Smith was a quarterback. Like, that was another game where just highlight reels that he did that day were just stupid. Absolutely stupid.
Yeah. I mean, that Tavon was nuts. Other offenses that come to mind that I've seen, I mean, 2 teams that didn't end up winning a national championship that I'm just shocked because of what they had on offense. Like, Oklahoma in 2017, the fact that they didn't put together a championship season's wild. I mean, you had Baker Mayfield. He passed for 2017.
Yeah.
I mean, Baker Mayfield passed for 4,600 yards. Rodney Anderson rushed for 1,100 yards, 13 touchdowns. That team also had Trey Sermon as the backup. I mean, your top receiving threats were Hollywood Brown, Mark Andrews, and CeeDee Lamb. Yeah. I mean, that's crazy to me. All over 800 yards receiving.
That's not even the best Oklahoma offense I've seen. Like seriously. You talk about, you want to do stats? This is why I keep talking about that 08 Oklahoma team that averaged 51 points a game. Sam Bradford that year passed for 4,720 yards and 50 touchdowns. All right, so think about that type of production. You had Joaquin Iglesias had 1,150 yards receiving. Jermaine Gresham at tight end had 950. Manny Johnson had 714. Ryan Broyles had 687 receiving yards. Quentin Chaney had 504 receiving yards. 5 guys with over 500 yards receiving. Here's the best part about it. They had 2 running backs over 1,000 yards. Chris Brown went for 1,220. DeMarco Murray went for 1,000, and he played only 13 games.
Good Lord.
They combined for 34 rushing touchdowns. So I just gave you crazy passing numbers, and they also had 2 running backs that went over 1,000 yards that year.
That's so nuts.
So, and they had another running back that ran for 475 in 6 touchdowns. But, like, here's the thing that comes down to it with a lot of those offenses you're talking about, Trev. They all had that one game where they got shut down.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about that Oregon offense in 2012. That was a phenomenal offense, but they got shut down in that one game by Stanford.
Yeah.
You look at that 2017 Oklahoma team. They're maybe the one exception. They scored 45 a game. Their lowest output of the season was 31. So they didn't, but there was a couple games they weren't great against Iowa State that year. But they lost to Georgia in the playoffs 54-48. They didn't lose that game because of their offense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They
yeah.
lost that game because of their defense. There's been some great offenses over the years, man. Somebody pointed to 2020 Bama. I have a hard time putting 2020 Bama because of the COVID stuff. It's so hard to really evaluate teams from that season. It really is, just for so many different reasons.
Oh yeah.
2018 Oklahoma was pretty flipping good too, Trev.
Is that Kyler Murray?
Yeah, and they averaged 3 more points a game that year than they did the year before. And the only team to hold them under 30 that year was Army because they just controlled the clock. They beat them 28-21. But, yeah, that team was pretty nasty too. Yeah, that game between West Virginia and Oklahoma in November of that year, the battle between Kyler and what was the name of the West Virginia quarterback? Will Greer. That was one of the most – if you love defense, that game would probably still haunt your dream. But just as far as entertaining game, that was such an. I think Notre Dame. That was what 2018. I was out in LA watching that game. It was a Friday night game. Notre Dame played USC the next night, and so I was in the hotel in LA waiting. I just gotten into the room watching that game in the hotel. It was just like a crazy, crazy game. So, yeah, that was a very fun game. Very fun game. Yeah.
Oh, man, that would have – yeah, I remember that game. That game was nuts. The only other offense off the top of my head that I was thinking about was 2021 Ohio State, just because of who they had on their roster. That receiving core was crazy. Jackson Smith and Jigba, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Emeka Egbuka, Marvin Harrison Jr.
Yeah. Scored 45.7 points per game.
Oh, my goodness.
It's and that team couldn't score on Michigan and couldn't score on Oregon.
Nope.
They ended up scoring late on Oregon, but they had to come back. Oregon whooped them and beat them. Yeah. But that team was very talented. There's no doubt about that. It's very talented. But you think about that team, Trevor. Just let me give you some context because how good that team was. That team scored 45.7 points per game. Right? It's pretty good, you would say. It's pretty good. They played Tulsa, Akron, and Rutgers that year. This is why I keep pointing to that 1995 Nebraska team, because that 1995 Nebraska team, the only team that they didn't play that was a Big 12 team or was like a big-time football team was Pacific. And they didn't pad their stats against that team, where you look at some of these other teams and you look at some of their outcomes that year, they were getting at some of their points from those games. Ohio State had 59 against Akron, 52 against Rutgers, and they scored points against other teams as well. But that 95 Nebraska team played Oklahoma State, Michigan State, Arizona State, Washington State, Missouri, Kansas State, Colorado, Iowa State, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Florida, other than Pacific. It was just that team was just crazy good. Crazy good. Somebody asked earlier, how would that team perform in today's, that's an irrelevant conversation, because guys are bigger now, but I'd say they still run the ball. They had a lot of NFL linemen. Their running back room was crazy good. But I say teams aren't built to defend that kind of offense nowadays. That's why you see teams like Army still go out there and put up a lot of yards running the football. Yeah. But their Army with way better players is what they are. But I'd say, okay, how would modern teams defend back then? Because they wouldn't be as big and they wouldn't be as strong. It's just a different era, so it really doesn't matter. But it's about how you dominated your era.
Oh, yeah.
And they dominated their era in a way that I just haven't seen since outside of LSU 2019. That's really the only exception, is that LSU. And I mean, honestly, Trev, you could say that the 2015 Nebraska team was more dominant over their competition. I would just argue that that LSU in 19 played against overall tougher competition. I do think the SEC in 19 was better than what the Big 12 was or it would have been the Big 8 was in 1995. And so I still think it was slightly tougher schedule, and still did what they did in 2019. But I mean, that LSU team in 19 scored 48.4 points per game. Think about that. That Nebraska team was 4 points higher than that. Yeah, that was crazy.
Aiden Benami, besides Walker, not counting Ivan Taylor, who was the last recruit that picked Michigan over Notre Dame when it came down to those two final schools?
That's a good question. When it actually came down to those two schools, not like a guy that still had one of those two schools on his list. Let's see here. Let's go commitment list. See what they did. I feel like there was a guy recently that picked them. I mean, you could count Amorian Walker. I mean, he flipped from Notre Dame to Michigan a couple years ago. Nathaniel Owusu-Boateng, although Notre Dame had dropped out of that one, so I don't count that one. So guys where it was 1-2 between the two. Obviously, this is referring to Javion Osborne, who announced that he's down to 2. Let's see here. 2024 class. Let's see here. Guys at Notre Dame actually won. I mean, you could say they flipped Owen Wafel, who was committed to Notre Dame. There's nobody else in that class. Yeah, I mean, you have to go back to Maureen Walker in the was a 23 class, 22 class, just because, I mean, Notre Dame flipped them. So, I mean, Michigan flipped them. So, obviously, Notre Dame would have been his number 2 if he was committed to Notre Dame. But I'm trying to go. Yeah, they haven't. Well, Michigan fans, and because of the numbnuts that covers I shouldn't say that. The guy that covers them for On3, who's an absolute clown, thought that Michigan was going to get Jadon Blair, but Michigan was never in the top 2 for Jadon Blair. It was always going to be Notre Dame or Penn State. And it was always going to be Notre Dame, as Irish Breakdown fans always knew. But, yeah, I mean, you could say that was a 1 versus 2 that went to Notre Dame's way, but they haven't been 1-2 for a lot of guys lately. And I don't count Ivan Taylor, because once he decommitted, Notre Dame was kind of out of that one. So, yeah.
Ryan Schulte, any word on Matt Ludwig? Saw he was offered and wanted to take an official visit. I know they have other tight end targets in 2026. And he has some other big offers. Why did it take so long to offer him? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I don't think he's still just a junior, and they did offer him a month or so ago. I just think it was about evaluating him and kind of how he fit the system. They're kind of going after some longer, taller, vertical guys. Ludwig's a little shorter, a little thicker than some of those other guys. But I think it was about just evaluating the room and evaluating. They were a little slow at tight end recruiting in this class, just because I think they wanted to kind of take their time and make sure they got the right guys on the board. And I think that's really what it comes down to. But, I mean, look, he likes them. They like him. I'm going to know a lot better kind of where things stand after we get some of these visits out of the way with other schools and with other players. But I think about timing, and I don't know that – I think there's – initially they were – I mean, you look at all the guys they offer, they were like 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", just some of those longer vertical type of guys more so than anything. So, yeah. That's kind of where I'm at.
Good deal. Andrew Gilmore, have you looked into Washington's Arkansas exit? Family related. Pittman really went after Washington in the postgame news conference when all of that went down.
Obviously, you know what Arkansas has said publicly. I'll just say this because I don't really care to get into this discussion because there's just a lot we don't know. But from what I have heard, I don't really like how Sam Pittman handled that situation. You have a young man who just lost a family member and didn't have a track record of not being able to answer the bell. And I think it was a coach that was a little bit on the hot seat that kind of took out maybe some things he was dealing with on a player. It's kind of how I read the situation. I do know that Notre Dame did a lot of due diligence into that situation and felt good about where he stood in his decisions. It was not something that they were unaware of what happened. So, yeah.
Salty Virginia Peanuts. Drake Bowen is a Pro Football Focus top 10 linebacker. What other position groups have or will have PFF top 10 returners?
Well, they have released running back. They had Jeremiah Love, I think one. They had Emil Wagner in the top 10 at tackle. They had Billy Schrouth in the top 10 at guard. And I don't think they've come back out with safeties or corners yet. I don't think those two position groups have been released. No, they have released the D-line, nobody there. I think the secondary positions are the only ones we're waiting on, Trev. I'm not 100% sure of that, but yeah, so Jeremiah Love, Billy Schrouth, Emil Wagner were all top 10 guys at their position group. So let me check here. So yeah, they've done quarterbacks. There was nobody. Running backs, they had Jay Love. Nobody at wide receiver. I don't believe none of the tight ends. Let me just go specifically where Emil and those guys ranked. Nobody on the edge. I don't believe. So Drake was 9. Yeah, Jeremiah Love was number 1. You had nobody at receiver. Just want to make sure. And nobody should at receiver just yet. They got to go prove themselves. They did have Malachi Fields honorable mention at wide receiver. That's right, because I did an article on that. And so he wasn't top 10, but he was honorable mention. Tight end, nobody at tight end. Offensive tackle, they had Emil at number, let's see here, 5. They had Billy Schrouth at number, where's Billy? I thought they had Billy Schrouth on I guess they didn't have Billy Schrouth on there. He was on somebody's preseason second-team All-America list. I thought PFF had him in their top 10, so he wasn't in their top 10. But theirs was interior, as opposed to guard center. It was interior, and then nobody on the edge. I don't believe. Yep, and then nobody obviously on the interior. So, and then Drake Ball number 10. So I would expect Leonard Moore to be in their top 5 at corner, and I won't be shocked if a Don Schuler is in their top 10 at safety, because he had a pretty good PFF score last year. I don't know how it's going to rank overall, but he had a pretty good PFF score last year. So, yeah, be close. So that's where I'm at. Good question, Salty.
Yeah. Tommy Guns, in the interest of today's show topic, where would the position groups of today possibly rank since 2010 in their respective groups?
So, Tommy, it's a little hard to answer that question now. This is probably a better question as we get into September, into July and August, when we have a better sense of what the team's going to look like. Because I didn't do rankings like we did today on past groups. But I will say this confidently. This is going to be the deepest running back room Notre Dame has had since Lou Holtz was the head coach. And it's not close. It's not even remotely close. So you can put them number 1 on this list. I think this offensive line has a chance to be one of the 3 or 4 best offensive lines of the last 15, 20 years. They're not going to be 2017. I don't know that they'll be 2020 just because 2020 was so consistent and steady. They weren't like dominant like 17. I don't know that this unit can be as good as 15, but they can get into that conversation depending on how some things go. Like, I think this offensive line has a chance to be really good. And if you're talking about being one of the 5 best O-lines at Notre Dame in the last 15, 20 years, you got a chance to be a really good offensive line. 15, 17 were unbelievable. 2020 was really steady, really solid. 2012 was a pretty good offensive line. And then 2013 was a very underrated offensive line. They didn't run the ball a whole lot because they didn't try. But that team only gave up 8 sacks all year with Tommy Reese at quarterback. And I don't mean to knock Tommy, but let's be honest. We all know Tommy wasn't a very mobile quarterback. And he wasn't avoiding sacks like he was Riley Leonard. It just means he had time to throw. So that was a pretty good offensive line. They were just a tad one-dimensional. They weren't quite as dominant in the run game. They had their moments, but they just didn't try to run the ball a whole lot. But yeah, that's and then the only offensive line Charlie Weiss had that was worth a darn was 05. The rest of his offensive lines were average to below average. So they got a chance to have one of the 4 or 5 best. D-line, let me see how Boubacar is health-wise. Let me see how Bryce Young continues to finish the spring. Let me see where Botelho is, because if the D-line tackle room continues to emerge and the D-ends are – this could be one of their best defensive lines in a long time. I don't know that their starters are going to be as good as like the 18 D-line, the 12 D-line, but from a depth standpoint, this could be one of the best D-lines they've had in a while from a depth standpoint. But in order to be one of the best overall, you're going to need some star power like they had in 2012 with Stephon and Lewis, like they had in 2018 with Khalid and Julian and Tillery. They need Boubacar, Bryce Young, and maybe a D tackle to kind of step into that role to be there. But they got a shot to be like the best of the next in line groups if Boubacar and Bryce Young and Botelho are all good to go this season. So that's another one. Anybody else, Trev? Like receiver room, it's way too early for that. Like, let me just see how they finish the spring. Quarterback room, again, a little early for that. Tight end room, no, it's not in the conversation with some of the units they've had in the past. The last one for me, this could end up being the best linebacker room that Notre Dame's had in a long time. There's no Jalen on this team. I don't know that there's a Manti on this team. But if you're talking about just starting a lineup, top to bottom, because like Jalen was playing next to Joe Schmidt and Manti was playing next to Dan Fox and Carlo Calabrese. Solid, good football players. Not Kingston, not Osbury, maybe not Jalen Sneed. They've got to prove it still. They're not there yet. But it won't shock me when it's all said and done if this is the best overall linebacker. Mawusu Koromoa played with Drew White and Shane Simon. Just different animal. The all-around unit to me could be arguably the best linebacker room they've had in a long time, just top to bottom. Without, again, no star like some of those other ones had, but top to bottom, this linebacker room could be really, really good.
Yeah, the only one that I'd add to that mix is corner, if I'm being honest with you. There is some projection a little bit with some of the guys that they have coming onto campus, but when you just look at the starting duo of Leonard Moore and Christian Gray, that's going to be special.
You know what makes it hard, Trevor, is that we're looking at a year ago, it was Christian, Leonard, and Benjamin.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, it's a great cornerback room, but it's just like, yeah, but is it going to be as good as last year's? You know what I mean? Like, that's a tough call. That's a tough call. That's why it's so important for that number 3 guy in this group to really step up.
Yep.
Like you were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. But corner would be the only other
good
one. Good
question, Tommy. Really proud of you for coming with some football questions, man. Very proud of you for some football questions. All right. We talked about the Olivia Miles thing. Let's see here. This is a fun one.
Salty Virginia Peanuts. What are 2 plays that Coach Denbrock favors and will use this season? Plays he couldn't use last season.
I can't hear you for some reason. Like you're not muted. Did you mute your mic?
No. Is that better now?
Can you guys hear Trevor? Try talking real quick.
Yeah. Can you hear me at all?
Okay. Apparently it's just me. Go ahead.
Well, what are 2 plays that Coach Denbrock favors and will use this season? Plays he couldn't use last season for several reasons. Uh,
So, Trevor, I don't know what you said because I can't hear you, but couple that I'll look into. I think that one thing we're going to see a little bit more this year that we didn't see last year is I think Mike Denbrock really likes four verts, and we didn't see them run a ton of that. We saw them run the conversion a lot last year with the stops, but it wasn't really a play where they were looking at the seams like a true four vert. They were looking to bang one of the outside routes. I think we'll see more of that this year than we saw last year. And the other one is I do think we're going to see something that is sort of a quick get outside run play. Is it buck sweep? Is it a toss crack? Is it a G scheme? That I don't know. But I think when you talk about the potential of having Jagasaw and Shrouth at guard, Craig at center, an athletic kid like Knapp potentially at left tackle, Emil at right. I mean, think about this. Your least if the starting line is what I think it's going to be, and this isn't a comment on what it should or shouldn't, but if it's just what I think it's going to be, if it's Knapp, Shrouth, Craig, Jagasaw, and Wagner, your least athletic player of that group, not pound for pound, just overall, is Charles Jagasaw, probably. Or maybe Ashton Craig, just pure athleticism. Now, pound for pound, you could argue Charles Jagasaw's way up that list, but just comparing my 40 time to your 40 time, not pound for pound, just comparing it, or your agility stuff. It could be him. That says a lot about how athletic that unit could be. I think you're going to see a lot more not a lot more. You're going to see them more willing to do movement where you're getting Jagasaw out in space. You're getting Emil out in space. You're getting Knapp and Shrouth and Craig. All of them can get out in space and move. So I think you're going to see more of that this season. And then in the screen game, I think we're going to see more of slip screen type stuff to Jeremiah Love. More running back screens where for the same reasons we just talked about with that, on top of this, slip screens were not a good idea last year because they were such a run-oriented team that and just couldn't scare you with the throwing game, that teams would just put 8 in the box constantly, either pre or post snap. They were always going to get at least 8 in the box, which means your slip screen numbers are not good. Slip screen is great against a team that's dropping 7 or dropping 8. Who's dropping 7 and 8 against Notre Dame last year? Nobody. And so now, because you're going to have more of a drop back quarterback presence, no matter who starts, now in some of these some of these second down situations, maybe even some of these third down situations, teams are going to be more willing to drop 8. And because, now you've got a quarterback, whoever it is, that's going to be more able to, on 3rd and 9, bang that slot fade to Jaden Greathouse or whoever, to throw that back shoulder to a Malachi Fields, or hit that deep end cut on 3rd and 7, maybe than more of what we saw last year. So do you really want to blitz these quarterbacks as much as maybe you did on 3rd down last year? May not be as good of an idea. And so I think that then opens up, Trev, some of those slip screen type of things that could be more effective on every down, really, just because of how teams are going to defend them.
Yeah. I think slip screens are going to be utilized a little bit more. I know they ran it.
We got one down here from Mark Avalone.
Mark Avalone, with preset edge rusher injuries, do you hear anything of Notre Dame pursuing Stanford's Bailey, who is in the portal?
All right, so I'm just kind of waiting, Trev, till your mouth stops moving because I still can't hear you. It's the weirdest thing. But everybody in the chat saying they can hear you. It's so crazy. I don't know what happened. So I'm going to have to fix this. But I haven't heard anything about Notre Dame will pursue him. I think they could. I think if they did, he might be interested. But I haven't heard anything yet. And so the issue there is, if you're going to get on him, you got to get on him now. There's 2 schools of thought here, Trev. One is, look, you just acquire talent. Like I said the other day, I'm putting all my chips in the table. And if you can get him to come here, to be part of a group, maybe not the guy, but you're going to bring him in here as like a pass rush specialist, and he's willing to accept that role, I'd bring him in. The only caveat is you need to make sure that you don't upset the entire room. In past years, Trevor, I wouldn't have cared if you upset the entire room because it's like you don't have anybody else like him on the team. That's not true now. With, if Boubacar's healthy, if Bryce Young develops, but the ifs are why you need to consider it because there's still, if Boubacar is back to full speed, if Patelho's back, if Bryce Young takes a jump. So it's a challenge, man. It's a challenge to kind of consider kind of what you're going to do. And I'm very curious to see kind of where they take it. But I haven't heard that they're going to make a move on him. I don't know. I'll say this, man. There's a lot of talent in that room, and the coaches love the room. And that makes me think ultimately that they're not going to make that move. But, I can't say for sure that that's going to be the case.
Yeah, we've talked about it before, and I don't think that any team is going to, especially Notre Dame, I don't think that they are going to do anything to not improve their roster. Mike Martin, when he came on, he said that he's always going to look for ways to improve their current roster. And Bailey could potentially, but is it somebody that you want to go and risk maybe throwing off some of the chemistry in that room? So that is definitely something that I think could be a factor into all of this. But again, I think depending on if it's the right person or not, Notre Dame could go after anybody in the portal. The only positions that I don't see them doing that is quarterback. I don't really see them adding another wide receiver, maybe depending on what the injury issues are.
It would have to be the right guy. Like, crap, we can't turn that. I have no interest in going after Emmett Mosley. Is he a good football player? Yeah, he's a good football player. They don't need another slot. They've got 87,000 slots on the roster who are all good football players.
Yeah.
Agreed. If a Will Fuller type of burner was out there, would I look at him? Yeah. But who's that guy? And he's probably jumping in the portal because he wants a payday. Mm-hmm. That's the reality of it. Like, studs don't jump in the portal at this point in time unless they kind of know where they're going and they're getting a lot of money, with the exception of the situation with USC or with Stanford because they just fired their coach. Mm-hmm. So, I just like corners a room that I would one that I would look. And I also would add O-line to that mix too, Trev. They're not going to add an O-lineman post spring unless there's some new injuries that they're worried about. Yeah. I don't see that one.
O-line, no. Quarterback, no. Linebacker, no.
Somebody said DT maybe. There's no need to go to D tackle. I mean, you already went and got two guys in the portal at D tackle. Plus, you've got all the guys coming back that you did. That's just not one you're going to go to. Again, it would have to be a situation where it's like a stud that jumps in and wants to come play for you. Yeah. Other than that, I don't know that there's a lot of those positions outside of corner from a depth standpoint. And then, like, if Caleb Downs jumped in the portal, would I look at him at safety? Yeah, definitely. That's true at every position other than running back. So, and there's not a quarterback that's that good for me. Like, there's no quarterback that could jump in. It's like, dude, I know you love the guys you have, but how do you not go after that guy? There's nobody like that in the room. So, I think this team is really good. You look at the position where there's still some ifs. And corner and D end are the two biggest if positions. Here's one position I would definitely look at, though. I would definitely look at tight end, especially if there's a blocking tight end in the portal. That is the one position I would be much more open to. But they may just say, "Hey, look, James Flanagan can do that." Who knows? That could be part of their conversation too. But
sure,
that would be the only one on offense. I'm like, yeah, you're definitely going to want to make sure that you keep your eyes open for that. Like, did the Sam Roush kid, did he jump in the portal? The kid from Stanford. Like, I don't know if he has jumped in the portal or not. If he jumped in the portal, I'd consider. Doesn't look like he has, but he's one that I would look at if he jumped in the portal. That's where I'd be.
Sure. Tommy Guns, what's the numerical difference between Notre Dame's NIL package compared to the dollar amounts that guys looking for a payday are getting?
Notre Dame is not trailing anyone in the amount of money they are willing to offer if they want a guy. The only thing that Notre Dame is quote unquote trailing other teams is they're not willing to pay a certain amount of money for certain players. Like, look, yeah, you're a good player, but we're not paying $4 million for a 1-year rental and D tackle. We're not doing that. We're not paying $1 million to a high school recruit who can't catch. I mean, we're just not doing that. I don't care that Alabama did. I don't care. I mean, it's just hypothetically speaking. It's more so like, yeah, that's not going to make sense. And Notre Dame also is more than willing to throw money out there. But again, it's got to be willing to throw money at a guy that wants to be part of what they're doing here as a team. I will not be shocked if we find out that Malachi Fields got pretty good money. But Malachi Fields also came here, bought into what they're trying to do, just like Riley Leonard was last year. Devontae Smith, I'm sure got a good NIL deal to come here. But I also think there was other reasons why this made sense for him. He's got a kid who I believe is back home in Ohio. He wanted to be closer to home. It's a great degree. He has a relationship. There's a trust there with Marcus Freeman and Mike Mickens. So those are all things that you look at and say, if they feel like we've got to get this guy, they're not going to lose a guy for money. Like Javari Flowers, the kid that committed to Florida yesterday. I was told the package for Notre Dame was greater. They just kind of got in a little bit too late because he was a 26 kid that reclassified to 25 late in January. And so if Notre Dame wants to, they can throw very good NIL deals together. It's just about whether or not they're willing to with certain players. And honestly, you got to be smart about that. You can't just go buy a team, because if guys aren't bought into what you're doing, then you're going to end up falling short. The team is still very, very important.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Here's an interesting one.
Archer452, the resident Ohio State fan in the chat. Question in here, which player will be the face of the team this year? The guy doing the most media appearances, commercials, etc.?
I have a hard time seeing anyone other than Jeremiah Love being that guy.
Yeah.
I expect him to be on the cover of CFB, College Football 2026. And yeah, I'd be surprised if he's not that guy. And he's a pretty engaging kid. You see him at press conferences and he's very matter of fact, but in other settings, he's very personable and very funny to be around. So I would say that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's going to be J Love too. I mean, he practically already is. I mean, honestly, so yeah.
Here we go.
Salty Virginia Peanuts. If the offensive line had suffered no injuries at all last season, what would have been the difference, season and postseason?
I think your offensive line would have been a lot better early on. The question would be, when Sam Pendleton, first of all, would Sam Pendleton have still started at guard? Or maybe Anthony Knapp would have moved inside earlier. Or maybe they would have gone with Rocco or Billy at left guard to try to get more of a power side. I don't know. But let's just say that Pendleton starts because they thought he was the best guy for the job. I think what you would have seen is when he struggled, they just would have put Rocco in there and replaced him. And then it would have been Jagasol, Rocco, Craig, Schrouth, and Emil. And I think that unit playing together all season would have made him a much better team. Much better team. And I think pass pro would have been better. Jagasol can just get away with certain things at left tackle that the other kid can't, because just size and just girth and power. He's a year older, a year stronger in the weight room than Anthony Knapp. What would have been interesting is if Jagasol doesn't get hurt. Does that create at any point in time any kind of domino effect had Craig still been hurt? Like if Ashton Craig gets hurt, we know that Joe Rudolph loves Anthony Knapp. Would that have been the thing that maybe it gave him a chance to move inside and play that position? Something I've thought about. But the Jagasol injury just kind of started a domino effect that's kind of impacted all this other stuff. But it'd have been an outstanding offensive line by the end of the year, just because you would have had so much more continuity. I mean, Emil Wagner starts the season off communicating with with, who was it, Billy Schrouth, and then it moves to Rocco, and then all of a sudden, second half against Penn State, it's Charles Jagasol. Anthony Knapp starts the season off with a redshirt freshman next to him, and then eventually gets a veteran player, which helped a little bit. Your interior, you started the season off with Sam Pendleton, Ashton Craig, and Billy Schrouth. You ended the season with Schrouth flipped to left guard, and then Rocco at right guard and Pat Coogan at center. I mean, you had no continuity at a position that needs continuity. And so that's kind of, I think it would have been a much more effective offensive line, especially in pass pro. So, yeah, thoughts on that, Trev?
Yeah, man. I think on the field results in the regular season, I think you would have seen Riley Leonard get a lot more comfortable quicker in the season. I don't know if that translates to him passing for 250 yards a game, because some of the issues that Riley had in the pass game were not just with the offensive line. But we did talk about it as the regular season went on, that, maybe one of the reasons why he's struggling a little bit is just because his internal clock is sped up a little bit, because he's getting hit on quick game. We saw that. I think in the postseason, I think they would have been able to run the ball a little bit more consistently if there were no injuries and everybody was able to play the same. Because there was a noticeable difference when they were able to run the ball in the first half of the Penn State game versus the second half of the Penn State game. Now, some of their issues running the ball in the postseason, Jeremiah Love wasn't at 100% really throughout the entire postseason. So that was a factor as well. Again, not just on the O-line, but I think initially those are some of the things that you would have seen. Is the pass game would have came alive significantly earlier than what it did in the regular season. And I think that you would have seen this offense been able to run the ball better in the postseason.
I think you will. I wonder what the run game would have looked like early as well, if Jagsaw's at left tackle. But I don't know that that's a part of Anthony Knapp's game that I thought was a problem, even really from the opener. We've talked about this before. I mean, it's like, yeah. But here's another question, Trev. Like, if Charles Jagasol is your starting left tackle, do they make a different decision at guard? Like, would they have started Rocco at guard instead of Pendleton? And then I think the run game would have been even better early on. Yeah. Send me the chat. Josh Phillips said that they probably don't lose to NIU. I don't know that I believe that, because that's basically saying Charles Jagasol over Anthony Knapp is the reason they lost to Northern Illinois. And I don't know that I would grant that premise. I mean, that if the only difference is the left tackle, Knapp versus Jagasol, I think the entire offensive line got their butts whooped. And Schrouth and Craig didn't get hurt till the next week. So they were all healthy. The only guy they were missing was Jagasol, who's a very good player, but I don't know if he's the difference between winning and losing that game. Notre Dame had a lot of other issues that game, besides Anthony Knapp at left tackle, and again, yeah, I don't know if that's the difference. I really don't, and I don't even know that was the worst game that Anthony Knapp played. Yeah, I'm not sure I can go there with that one. To be honest with you, I don't know that would have been the difference, but I think it could have been the difference, Trev, had he made a better decision, speaking of Joe Rudolph, in the other areas. Like if starting Jagasol also meant starting Rocco. Like I think that could have impacted the Northern Illinois game. Because now it's like it's you're probably going to have Schrouth at left guard with Jagasol. You're going to have Rocco with Emil. Maybe that the two of them is enough to change their fortunes up front against Northern Illinois. But just swapping Knapp out for Jagasol, I don't know necessarily changes that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I agree.
So it would have required some other – Jagasol being healthy would have required something else to get in there. Yeah, absolutely. Last one here, Trev. Let me see here. Tommy, your question about Jack snaps. Can you bring that one up on the next mailbag? The one about there's a really good question. We talk a lot about Riley Leonard's snaps getting split up, but not about Jack Kaiser's. I think it's a really good question. I'd rather dive into that at a later time. Salty, we'll get to some of your other questions here. I want to bring this one up here from Lou Holtz, Thunder and Bolts. He says, great show, gents. Thank you for the super chat. He goes, great show, gents. Requesting prayers for my wife. She's battling some health challenges that are becoming increasingly debilitating in recent weeks. Yes, my man, we absolutely will do that. As soon as we stop this show and I finish my conversation with Trevor, before I do anything else, I will make sure that I stop and pray for your wife. I would encourage all the others in the chat to do that. And if anyone's like me, that I said, man, I'll definitely pray for you, and then I don't, because I just think, just really stop and right now and just lift up his wife up in prayer and just pray for healing and pray for wisdom for the doctors around her. Pray for wisdom for you to be the strong husband that she needs. And then just obviously as we just ask that she find healing, if that be God's will, that she find healing as well. So we'll definitely continue to lift her up. Keep us posted on how things are going, and don't hesitate to ask for this again, because prayer is not a one-time thing. It's pray without ceasing, and you don't get like one shot at it. Like, okay, I prayed once, and he's either going to say yay or nay. Just as the Bible teaches us, man, sometimes it's God wants you to continue asking for whatever reason in his divine wisdom, but just continue to do that. And we will continue to keep your wife in our prayers. And I appreciate you come to us with that today. Very, very much. So just be strong for her, and keep us posted, my man. So Trev, that'll do it, man. Why don't you take us out of here?
Ladies and gentlemen, it was an awesome show today. Really good topics of conversation. And we're going to continue to talk about Notre Dame as spring progresses. It's going to get a lot more open, because in a week, Brian and I will be headed up to South Bend talking about the full practice that we get to see this upcoming Saturday. And then obviously the Saturday after that, we have the Blue Gold game. Hope to see a lot of you guys there. But listen, folks, before we get out of here today, please be sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Share this podcast with your friends and family. Anybody that loves Notre Dame and college football as much as you do. Whichever streaming platform you watch us on, whether it's Spotify Podcasts or Apple Podcasts, we greatly appreciate a 5-star review. But as always, the best way to support what we do here at Irish Breakdown is subscribe to the premium message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com. So until next time, that's Brian. I'm Trevor. We will see you back here very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.